Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Resolve. As Ichigo came back to his senses, it felt like his whole body was on fire, and wasn't it funny that, after the last few months, he now knew precisely what that was like, as every minimal movement sent a surge of pain throughout his body. Eventually, after staying still for a few moments, the pain faded to a dull, background sensation. It was still there, but he could grit his teeth and tolerate it if he didn't make any more than small movements. You'll want to stay as still as you can for the next few hours, or all of the work I did will be wasted. Suturing souls is delicate work, and won't last long if you don't give it time to take. Ichigo slowly, very slowly, turned to his side, where his father was putting away a set of tools that were glowing with his Ryutsu. Ishine didn't seem to particularly care, as he went on. You should be glad that your friend's healing abilities were powerful enough to save your life. What were you thinking, fighting something capable of trashing you like that? Ichigo didn't know how to answer that, and after a few moments of silence, Ishine shook his head in disappointment. I would ground you, but you wouldn't care, so it's pointless. I just hope you've learned your lesson from this ordeal. With this spiritual stuff, it's much better not to get involved at all. I'll go tell your friends they can see you now. That annoyed Ichigo. It wasn't like he'd gotten involved because he wanted to, he'd just wanted to learn how to protect his family and friends. After all, the whole ordeal had been a success. He might have gotten hurt at the end, but they'd still recovered the Hujioku and saved the world. Really, you should kill him for dismissing you like that. Ichigo's blood suddenly went cold. He could feel the disdain of the inner hollow as if it was his own, and it took him a moment to separate the two, because, he realized, it wasn't being filtered anymore. He tried to dampen the feeling, only for the sense of condescension to grow stronger in response. You really think you can keep me under control on your own? Ichigo. Orium's arrival distracted Ichigo, as the girl moved next to him, clearly about to go for a hug but stopping at the last moment, wringing her hands as she said, "Your father said we should let you stay still until you finish recovering." I'm so sorry, Ichigo. What? What do you have to be sorry for? My power, it couldn't rewind you to before the moment you were wounded. I tried, but it only managed to bring you back to the moment your soul was ripped apart. That's why your father had to sew it together. You were hurt, and I couldn't help. Ichigo offered a sad smile as he answered, tiredly. You helped enough. Dad said I'd have died if not for you. He clenched his fist, heedless of the pain the gesture caused him, even as he glanced down at his covers and continued. I was the one who couldn't help at all. That Shinigami showed up to arrest Rukia, and I couldn't do anything to stop him. He took me down so easily. Rukia was kidnapped then. Ichigo's eyes trawled up once more, to where Ishida and Chad were staying next to the door. He would have shook his head, but he could feel the pain before he even started to, so he merely said, Not exactly. What do you mean? She pretended to go of her own will, but she only did it to stop him from killing me. She told me, in her own way, that she knew what she was doing, and to trust her. But, she only had to do it because of me. Because I'm a failure. You're not a failure. Orium's shout was loud enough that Ichigo turned just a little to look in her direction, even despite the pain. The girl looked angry, even with Tatsuki's hands on her shoulders attempting to keep her calm, her cheek red from the surge of emotion as she went on. You did all you could, I know you did. Nobody is perfect and does everything right. You can't call yourself a failure just because you lost once. Ichigo closed his eyes, unsure how to respond, and then he had to ignore the whispered answer echoing in his mind afterwards. What does she think she is, to tell you that you're wrong? Why don't you put her back in her place? In an effort to ward off the hollow's words, he answered, hesitantly. If doing all I could was not enough, what's even the point? The point is that you'll do better next time. Tatsuki, tell him he's being silly. The black-haired girl behind Orium was surprised at being called upon like that, and she couldn't hide a grimace as she said, in a sad tone. I don't know, Orium, sometimes, you're just, not good enough, you know. Orium turned suddenly to watch Tatsuki with her eyes wide and huge, and then she narrowed her eyes as she said, What's gotten into you all of a sudden? You're the one that taught me that losing a match was no reason to stop trying, that it was just a learning experience so you'd win next time. You said that's the core of martial arts, to constantly improve, and you can't improve if you're already the best. Then she turned again, this time pointing a finger at Ichigo as she continued. And Ichigo, you're so cool because you never give up. No matter what happens, you keep getting back up and finding a way forward. To think that you're worthless when you're just in the middle between falling down and getting back up is not like you at all. Ichigo was surprised for a moment, and Orium placed her closed fists on her hips while puffing her cheeks in annoyance as she glared at him, as if daring him to disagree with her. It brought to mind many times when his friend had complained just like this for the smallest of things, except that this time, she was complaining because he wasn't trusting himself, while she did. And, he remembered, Rukia had said she trusted him, as well. What sort of man would he be, if he let them down when they expected so much of him? He closed his eyes, letting out a long breath before saying, as he opened them again. You're right, Orium, I'm sorry. I forgot myself there for a moment. She beamed at him at that, clapping her hands together. That's great. I knew you would pick yourself up. Then she frowned, looking uncertain as she asked. So, what do we do now, to help Rukia? We can't just let her be imprisoned, right? Ichigo let out a long breath. I don't know. I have no idea how we could possibly help, and I'm not in the best condition right now. Chad looked thoughtful, then said. You have lost the sword, right? Ichigo sighed. Yes, but it isn't only that. Without Sode no Shirayuki to help, I'm also hearing voices now. He glanced at Tatsuki, whose eyes widened at that as she commented. So, you lost your filter then? I did, and it's exactly as uncomfortable as you said it was. Orium looked at both of them with some confusion while Tatsuki's eyes looked doubtful for a moment, before suddenly gaining a sense of purpose as she said. Then I guess I'm taking that offer after all, or rather, we are. What are you two talking about? Ichigo's eyes moved to Ishida, and after Tatsuki had given a confirmation nod, he explained. The Vizard left Tatsuki a message, where they're offering to train her into controlling her inner hollow the way they do. We wanted to discuss the offer with you all to see what sort of trick it might be hiding before Tatsuki would decide whether to accept or not, but I guess now that I don't have Sode no Shirayuki to help me control my own inner hollow, and thus would need the help as well, Tatsuki just decided to take the risk anyway. He glanced at the girl herself and added, seeking confirmation, isn't it? Ichigo's best friend nodded at that and said, voice hard. Yes. It's a risk, but we don't know how long we're gonna have to help Rukia, and if we need to face off against a guy who could take down Ichigo so easily, we're gonna need all the training we can get. Ishida seemed to consider their words, then said, thoughtful. Actually, I think only Tatsuki should take the offer. The girl turned to glare at him. What do you mean? Ichigo is gonna need the help as well. I agree, but the offer wasn't for him, they might not be willing to teach him. But if you show up on your own, assuming their intentions are honest, you can learn all you can, and then teach Ichigo himself. And meanwhile, I can help him by giving him pointers into how to use Quincy abilities while you're off training, however little he learns from that, maybe he can use it alongside the Hollow's power in some way. Ichigo focused on Ishida, and asked. So, you think Tatsuki should accept? That it isn't a trap? Or did you figure the trap out already? The Quincy shook his head. No, it'd be impossible to guess at what the trap might be, if there even is one. But one or two of Orium's fairies can keep watch on everything Tatsuki does inconspicuously, and if anything worrisome happens, they can come and tell us. It's pointless to try and plan for every possible move they could make, it's much better to just be ready for any surprise and keep a flexible mindset. So long as we know it might be a trap of some kind and don't lower our guard, we should be able to foil it. Tatsuki closed her fist at that and answered in a determined tone. Don't worry, I'll be ready for anything. Orium nodded along at that, as would have Ichigo if he could do it without pain. Chad, however, looked thoughtful for a moment before eventually he said. That's not gonna be enough. What do you mean? If we want to help Rukia, we also need to learn what happened to her. Oh, how would we do that? Ichigo fixed his gaze on Chad after Orium's question, but his friend didn't answer, his eyes instead fixed on Ichigo, as if waiting for him to answer it. Which meant he expected Ichigo to know it already. He couldn't figure it out immediately, but then he realized it, realization filling him for a moment before he suddenly felt quite tired. We will need to go talk with Yurayuki and Urahara. They are the only ones we know who can tell us about what's going on in Soul Society. That's a good idea. Why are you looking unhappy about it? I might have ruined any chance of them helping us with the way I shouted at them last time. Orium looked confused for a moment before asking. So you'll just need to apologize, what's difficult with that? Ichigo couldn't help but be amused at Orium's directness. He glanced at Chad, who silently nodded, and then he said, feeling a bit more upbeat. I guess you're right, Orium, it'd be silly to hold on to pride when a friend is in danger, right? Orium nodded emphatically at that, looking very determined. Of course. The only important thing is to keep everybody safe, no matter how difficult. Ichigo didn't disagree with that, but he did worry. After what happened, being forced to trust these Shinigami once more did not sit well with him at all. Since Kurosaka would be better off with dedicating a whole day to recover before they went to meet the Shinigami at Urahara's shop, most of them left him to it, although Orium stayed behind to keep him company despite the fact the clinic and his home were a single building, so he had his family there to do the same. But then, Urayu had long stopped questioning the girl's decisions. Arisawa decided to go leave a message to the Vizard that she was willing to entertain the possibility for a meeting, so Urayu found himself leaving alongside Chad. While the situation was more of an happenstance than planned, the Quincy decided this was a good time to satisfy a small curiosity of his. Back there, you encouraged Kurosaka to go apologize to the Shinigami. He didn't realize, because he left so quickly, but the cat captain looked contrite afterwards, and Aizen said they would remain open to working with us regardless. And even if he didn't show up, they would have still helped us, at least. I am aware. Which means that it is entirely unnecessary for Kurosaka to apologize to them. But you encouraged him to do it anyway. Chad nodded, but didn't elaborate. Urayu frowned, a bit annoyed at the lack of answer, and pressed on. Why? Because Ichigo needed it. Urayu's frown was very minute, as he tried to hide his lack of comprehension and try to figure out the other boy's reasoning on his own, but clearly he wasn't quick enough, or perhaps Chad was just observant enough to notice anyway. Ichigo was not wrong to stand up to the Shinigami. But he was wrong to leave in fury. The correct thing to do would have been to find a way to work things out with them instead. Urayu raised an eyebrow at that. Would it? I don't see what's wrong with refusing to work with the Shinigami when they're so clearly more interested in doing things their own way than doing what needs to be done. Chad studied Urayu for a few long moments, then asked, in a way that implied the question itself to be the point, rather than any answer Urayu could give. What do you think will be the solution to your people's problem with Shinigami? Urayu frowned, considering he was pretty sure Chad didn't actually care about his answer. He considered the question itself, and come to what seemed to him like the obvious conclusion. You think that the Quincy will be more easily accepted if we talk with the Shinigami? They aren't interested in talking to us, they only want to preserve their position of power. You think that fighting won't produce any result for us, but you're wrong. We Quincy are stronger than you think, we're worth more than just the scraps they'd feel like throwing at us, and we can prove it. Chad shook his head, surprising Urayu as he said. You misunderstood me. Maybe you would win your war with them, if you push things to that point, but will it be worth it? I imagine you have friends among the Quincy, do you imagine they would all survive a war? Rukia probably has friends among the Shinigami. Should your people win that war, would you be able to spare them all? Or would you make her pay with the lives of her friends for your victory? Urayu didn't have an answer prepared to that, and before he could find one, Chad went on. Victory is never without price. You need to choose what is the price you would be willing to pay. By talking, the price might be that you only get some of what you want, instead of getting it all, but you will build a stronger base for others, in the future, to build their own victories on, and carry your cause forward. Urayu considered Chad's words for a moment, letting out a long breath before eventually answering. You make that sound easy, but sometimes you can't win just with words, that's not how the world works. Why would the leaders of the Shinigami accept to let us win anything at all by talking, when they have all the power? Chad didn't seem persuaded, although his tone was still the same, without any anger or reproach in it. I am not telling you to not defend yourself, that is what strength is for, to protect the things you care about from those who would hurt them. But if you fail to try every peaceful path to victory first, then you're taking upon yourself the burden of the price that will be paid. Uriah frowned. It wasn't that he disagreed with Chad, exactly, but things were rarely that cut and dry, and besides, he and his fellow disciples had been training to fight for a long time. And the souls who signed up to be Shinigami did it knowing it could lead to their death. If they were willing to defend the leaders that treated his people like trash, then it was hardly his fault if some of that had to suffer for the choices they freely made, was it? He wasn't sure how much sure he was of it all. He certainly had never considered Chad's position before, never considered that some Shinigami could be more than mere enemies, but he was hardly going to simply throw away everything he grew up knowing just because of a short talk. There had to be a better solution than what Chad was saying, and perhaps a peaceful solution was there, waiting to be found, but Uriah Ishida had never been the type to bet on things he couldn't measure. Nodding to himself, he straightened and said, his tone growing cold. Then perhaps I might be willing to take that burden, to pay that price. Surprising him, Chad inclined his head in acceptance. That is your decision to make for yourself. I am no sage, to tell people how to live, I am telling you how I would live, myself. You can make of it what you will. Uriah frowned. He was pretty sure he'd lost the point of the conversation, if Chad hadn't been trying to persuade him of the correctness of his own point of view. Then what is it you were saying? I was saying that deciding not to talk, it has a price. You might be willing to pay it willingly, but would Ichigo? Especially when he would have been paying it merely due to ignorance, and a misunderstanding of what really happened. Uriah wasn't sure what to make of it, but Chad merely shrugged and went on. Ichigo might have been willing to ignore the possibility of solving things with words, but the decision had to be his. I didn't tell him what to do, but to let him make the wrong decision because of a misunderstanding would have made me a bad friend. It is not just my strength that I was given to protect others, my words should do that as well. Or at least, that is what I believe. Uriah didn't know what to say to that, so he merely remained silent until they each went their own separate ways. Still, despite the fact Chad had simply agreed to disagree with Uriah, rather than pushing his point on him, the young Quincy couldn't help but keep thinking over what he'd said. He kept thinking about it for a long time. Tatsuki entered the dark warehouse with a careful step. She looked around, trying to see where the Vizard might be hiding, but couldn't see anyone. Frowning, she looked back at the paper in her hand, the one she'd found after leaving the message that she wanted to meet, and confirmed the time was the correct one. Yet, the place looked completely empty. She waited for a bit, kicking a wooden box in frustration, and was about to turn around and leave when a voice suddenly echoed throughout the warehouse, sounding amused. You're not very patient, are you? Tatsuki almost jumped, before turning around and finding a short girl with blonde hairs arranged into pigtails, a sword negligently slung over her shoulder as she slowly seemed to emerge out of the darkness, in a place Tatsuki was sure had been empty when she'd watched at it before. She instinctively went into a guard position at the surprise, before forcing herself to take a big breath and relax. This caused the other girl to chuckle and comment. Those are good instincts. I was right about you. Tatsui frowned. What do you mean? I mean that you're a real fighter. I thought so when Mashiro said how you went all out in your battle with her, but without talking with you, I couldn't be sure. So I decided to find a way to talk to you one-on-one. I've not really been able to talk with somebody who understands what true fighting is like in a while, you know. Tatsuki grimaced at that. She wasn't proud of that particular fight. I'm not sure I should be complimented, I almost killed myself there. To her surprise, the blonde girl scoffed. So what? If you're not putting your life on the line to take your opponents, then you can't really call it a fight, can you? The fact you went that far shows you've got the right spirit. Suddenly, Tatsuki's worry that this would be a trap abated. Her interlocutor was clearly insane. Even so, if she could teach her anything, Tatsuki would take the lessons, assuming that was what the other girl actually wanted. If you truly believe that one should go all out in a fight, then, why would you train me? I'm your enemy, aren't I? The blonde girl laughed openly at that. You're not serious, are you? Even with an awesome teacher like me, it'll take 1,000 years before you're a match for me. And teaching you will also be a form of training for myself, so it isn't as if I'm getting nothing out of it, but there is another thing I want, that is true. Tatsuki immediately went defensive at that. I won't betray my friends for you. She didn't expect the threatening smile her declaration was answered by. Good. I'd hate to train a piece of scum like that. I wouldn't ask that of you. And besides, you don't even have Shinji prisoner, do you? How do you know that? Because we had the Kid Fullbringer, the one with the dimensional power, surveying the area from afar, so even after we left, he was able to determine that Shinji was kidnapped by Hollows, not by you people. And you don't care that we took the Hujioku? The blonde girl paused, seeming surprised, and Tatsuki realized why when she asked. You're saying that the Hollows kidnapped Shinji, but you managed to steal the Hujioku from him before they did. Tatsuki didn't answer that, but apparently her face betrayed her, which caused the blonde girl to chuckle. I suppose the others will be interested to learn that, but no, I don't really care about that thing. It's useful as a weapon, but it'd not really help us any with achieving our goal. Saving Shinji is much more urgent, but you can't really help me with that, can you? Tatsuki shook her head, to which the girl just shrugged. As I thought. But there is another thing you can do for me. One of your friends is called Yasutara Sato, right? Yes. Good. So, in exchange for my training, I want you to tell him that I want a duel between the two of us. He can choose when and where, so long as he doesn't make me wait too much. I just want a proper rematch with him. Tatsuki didn't know what to think of that, but it wasn't like she had many options at this point. So she answered, cautiously. I can't make that decision for him. And what if he doesn't want to agree? Then I'll only tell you enough to teach you how not to get killed by that thing inside of you, but if he accepts, I'll teach you how to truly use it for fighting. I think that's fair, don't you? You learn to fight, and I get a fight of my own. Everybody wins. Except for the person who dies. Tatsuki had tried to say that in a shading tone, but the girl nodded enthusiastically at that, a big grin on her face. Exactly. Girl, you really get me. We're going to get along greatly, I know it. Then she extended her free hand, the one not holding her sword, and finally introduced herself. I'm Hiyori Sakuragi. Who would you be? Tatsuki Arisawa. She clasped the other girl's hand, finding that her grip was quite strong. Still, Tatsuki was used to that, so she didn't really let it faze her, which was the right move, if Hiyori's grin was anything to go by. She really hoped this all worked out. Her friends were counting on her to succeed at this. Chapter 32, Morals. Rukia found that the thing she hated most in her current imprisonment was the sheer boredom. She'd been imprisoned in the cells underneath the inner citadel, just a building away from where the Central 46 hold council and under the control of the 2nd Division, but the guards were at the beginning of the corridor and the whole row of cells, outside of her own, were completely empty, meaning she was completely alone, except for the time when they brought her food. And even then, the guards were all masked and refused to engage her in conversation, which was expected from members of the Omnitsukido, but still annoying. Still, it could be worse. While they'd not told her the specific of how the process would go, Rukia knew that, traditionally, the Central 46 would convene to interrogate a witness, then spend a session of deliberation, and then have an interruption before calling on the next witness and repeating the process until they'd reached a final unanimous judgment. The same witness could be called multiple times if more doubt rose over their deposition or the 46 wanted clarifications upon something, so the process could take a while, and there was no telling when Captain Eisen would be called and how long it would take, after he'd been heard, for the 46 to judge her innocent. At least, she had no idea about it until one of her guards opened the door and announced, in a monotone she knew was engineered to help him hide his emotions, which she could still feel as containing a substantial amount of nervousness. Visitor for the prisoner. Then it was a very familiar and welcome voice that answered, in a polite and respectful tone. Thank you, we shall not be needing supervision. Rukia could feel the guard wanting to argue, but despite how much the man wanted to, he didn't, clearly not willing to openly defy a direct order from a captain, even one so well known for his affability as Captain Eisen was. She couldn't help but feel relief as he smiled to her, waving in greeting. "Rukia, I am glad to meet you in person once more. And as unfortunate as the circumstances are, I am glad to see you are in good health at least." "I'm happy too, Captain. Tell me, have you spoken with the old man already? Are you here to free me?" A certain sadness appeared on his face, and Eisen gently shook his head as he answered. "Not yet, sadly. They shall speak with me 3 days from now, and I expect at least 1 day of further deliberation before matters are settled. They'll probably want to speak with you again, to confirm what I will say, but they should let you go free before then." Rukia nodded, offering a small smile of thanks at that. "I'm glad. It's good to know that soon things will be solved. It's not nice, being regarded as a criminal for trying to do the right thing, even if it's only by a few people who don't know the whole story." Captain Eisen nodded, reaching through the bars to encouragingly clasp Rukia's hands. The reassuring gesture was enough to make her feel a bit better. Once he could see in her eyes that she was more relaxed, Captain Eisen nodded and let go, then assumed the typical speculative expression that always marked him. "I have to admit though, your words make me wonder, if I was not here to save you, would you be willing to be regarded as a criminal by all, if it meant doing the right thing? After all, recognition shouldn't really matter, if one is doing what needs to be done." Rukia chuckled at that. It was just like Captain Eisen to want to discuss philosophy to take her mind off things, but right now she welcomed the chance. Then she thought the matter over for a moment. The idea that self-sacrifice should be done while looking for some form of recognition of course was sound, but I think that's a wrong way to put it. Being regarded as a criminal by many, or even the history books, isn't really a problem. It is a big price to pay, but some things are worth paying for. But I think that the judgment of those people who know the whole story matters. If they too think what you did was wrong, then you couldn't really say that what you did was right, would you? The captain seemed intrigued by her answer, and considered it for a moment before answering. What if there was a difference in interpretation? For example, let's say that the only people who know the truth have beliefs and values that don't match with your own, that they consider some actions that you see as righteous to be crimes, or crime to be virtuous. Would their opinion still matter then? Rukia smirked at that one. It was a pretty obvious trap, in her opinion, and answered. As long as I believed that somebody who shared my values and also knew the truth would agree that my decisions was right, that should be the only thing which matters. Also, if what I did was really the right thing, then wouldn't it be obvious to anybody who learned of it, regardless of their values? Captain Eisen smiled back in amusement. Perhaps they would. Then he turned more serious, and Rukia got the sense as he spoke that there was some further meaning to the question itself, although she wasn't sure what the point of it was. What if you had to do something that you yourself considered wrong, or maybe even to fight somebody who shared those values with you, in order to accomplish what was good? Would you be willing to sacrifice your own morals, if that was the price to pay? Rukia couldn't help but frown at the question. It wasn't that she didn't like it, exactly. She enjoyed tests and passing them, but it was far more weighty than the previous, more speculative ones, at least to her own eyes. She'd had to face down people who were perhaps just misguided in the visored, and the idea of having to face her friend was not easy to contemplate. But she remembered her last conversation with Ichigo, and the words almost come to her on her own. I wouldn't. If anybody I truly trusted told me I was doing the wrong thing, I would stop and listen. Because anybody I trust that much wouldn't ever oppose me if I was in the right. Or, if they were the ones in the wrong, I would stop anyway, and look for another way, one they could accept too, because they would do the same for me. That's what friendship is about, isn't it? The captain looked thoughtful for a moment, but then offered a soft smile as he said, I suppose I understand, real moral sacrifice can be hard. Rukia didn't really like that answer either. It almost implied that refusing to fight those she loved meant she would not do the right thing when necessary, which was not at all what she'd meant. But before she could, Captain Eisen went on, his expression switching to one of clear amusement. Although I think you do pretty well with tiny moral sacrifices, like tricking people who are supposed to find things into finding nothing. How did you manage that, exactly? It was clear that the captain was speaking of Tuanchek of her having found nothing. Of course, he couldn't say that openly, not in the cells they were in. After all, it had been the 12th Division that had done the work of installing the listening devices that filled every cell, and Rukia herself had participated in the testing of them, so she knew for a fact that every word they shared here would be monitored and recorded. And considering they still had no idea of precisely what was going on with Captain Jin and everything else, letting anybody know about the Hujiaku, or where it truly was, before Captain Eisen had had the chance to explain everything to the Central 46 was too risky. She could, however, explain things obliquely, so she tried to make it clear in both her voice and feelings that she genuinely was being honest, rather than hiding any plot, since it had been pure chance that she'd not had the thing on her person when she was arrested. I can't really take any merit for that, it's not hard for nothing to be found when there's nothing there. I've always thought that it's wise to leave important things in the hands of trusted friends, although I hardly expected it to work to my favor in such a manner. I wasn't expecting it at all, to be honest. The captain's eyes widened in understanding, which was quickly followed by his usual reassuring smile as he said, "I understand. Even if not intentional, it was still a wise decision. Cautiousness always is, I've found." Then he got up, getting ready to leave as he went on. "Don't worry, Rukia, I have everything well in hand, you shall be out of here soon." "Thank you, Captain." "Think nothing of it, but before I go, I wanted to ask if there was something you wanted? I care about you, and short as it might be, I would want the time you'll spend here to be as comfortable as it can be, under the circumstances." Rukia smiled at the captain's consideration. It was one of the things that set him apart, and made him so approachable where many other weren't, and she said with a chuckle, "I don't think you can do much, Captain. The only real problem I've had here has been loneliness and boredom, but I don't think that's something anybody else can solve for me." He smiled, reaching through the bars once more to ruffle her hairs, something she wouldn't allow somebody else to do, but somehow the way Captain Eisen did it always felt comforting rather than patronizing, as he answered happily, "I think I could, actually. I will speak with SWAFON, and arrange for Momo at least to be able to visit you. I think that should do nicely to solve your problem, won't it?" Rukia's eyes widened at the offer. "You can do that? How?" "Well, as your captain, I am authorized to ensure your well-being as long as you are not condemned for anything. That's why we could have this meeting. To request that the visits be daily is within my right, as is having one of my officers to check on my behalf. I think that'll work, don't you?" Rukia was left quite surprised. She wouldn't have thought of that, but then grinned back and merely whispered, happiness filling her. "Thank you, Captain, that's, just thank you." He smiled and waved as he left, and Rukia sat back down on her cell, the smile still on her lips as she watched Captain Eisen's retreating back. It was nice to know that such a smart and good man was in her corner. Ichigo had to take a long breath as he mustered the strength to knock on the door to Urahara's shop. Orium squeezed his arm in an encouraging manner when she realized he was hesitating, so eventually he did. It took a brief moment for the shopkeeper to show up. When he did, he eyed the two of them from underneath his green cap with what looked like genuine curiosity, although he didn't say anything, not even a greeting. Which, Ichigo had to admit, was something he should have expected. "Hi. I wanted to apologize for my words last time. I let my emotions blind me to how things would look from your point of view." Urahara's lips morphed into his habitual smile, but there was a glint to it that made it less reassuring and more threatening than usual. "So, you need something from us, I imagine." Ichigo looked up, unsure how to answer that without making it sound like his apology was dishonest, but Urahara waved him off as he continued. "It's fine, your Yuaki might have made you do some sort of penance for offending her as you did, but she's not here right now, and that kind of thing is not my style." He motioned for them to follow him, and the two of them did. Ichigo had wanted the rest of his friends to come along, but Tatsuki had her own training to see to, and Chad had insisted that he and Ishida shouldn't come along, which the Quincy had, for some reason, agreed to quickly enough. Ichigo planned to ask them what that was about later, but for now, he had another friend to ask about. Once they reached the shop's backroom, Urahara sat down and said, quick and direct. "So, you're here to know what's going to happen to Rukia, right?" Ichigo stiffened at that, but Orium's hand squeezing his helped him relax as he asked. "How do you know?" "Captain Eisen told us. Rukia has been arrested for being here without authorization." Normally, that would be punishable with a few years of imprisonment at the worst, but apparently charges of treason are being considered on the ground of the man who reported Rukia having seen her in the company of Vizard in a non-antagonistic fashion. Ichigo's eyes widened at that. Is that gonna be trouble? I thought this mission was a success, shouldn't that be enough to solve any problem? We hope so. Captain Aizen has been called upon to testify on the matter, and should be good to do it in a couple of days. Once he does and explains the mission's result, Rukia will surely be released. Ichigo let out a long breath, feeling relieved at the information. That's good to know. Thank you. Urahara crossed, once more offering that slightly manic grin of his. Are you honest about those thanks, or is it just more pretending to be polite because you need something, like your apology earlier was? Ichigo felt angry at his words being dismissed like that, and almost immediately, his anger flared up, almost wrapping itself around him like a deadly coat as his Hollow's voice rose once more. You should show him what it's like to be sorry, make him be the one who has to apologize. He immediately focused on keeping the feeling at bay, this time squeezing Orium's hand himself for support before eventually answering, in as polite a tone as he could manage. I didn't apologize just because I wanted to know about Rukia. I won't lie, it certainly was a reason I showed up, but even before that, I and Rukia spoke to each other. She made me see that things aren't always as simple as we'd want that to, and that just because I disagree with somebody's actions, it doesn't mean they did not have valid reason for taking them. Ichigo let out a long breath, feeling somewhat less weight on his chest at admitting this, then raised his eyes to try and meet those of Urahara, hard as that could be with both his hairs and head hiding them, and added. Don't get me wrong, I still don't agree with the way Yuki handled all of this. I've not changed my mind, nor did I came here to lie. I just wanted you to know that I realize I was only thinking about myself and my own position there, and I understand why that was unjust of me. Urahara seemed surprised for a moment, then went back to smiling, although this time it was his more usual salesman's smile. Well, that's certainly surprising, but I'm glad to hear that you've truly had a change of heart. If so, then I'm sure you'll be happy to thank me in a way that might help both us, right? Ichigo could feel a shiver go down his spine at the sudden display of joy from the scientist as he answered, cautiously. What did you have in mind? Well, it is my understanding that, in your misguided attempt to stop Rukia's brother from taking her away, you managed to broke the Auswell and lose your connection to her Zanpakuto. Is that correct? Ichigo glanced to his side, where he was still carrying the black sword. Of course, while hidden by the sheath, the blade was broken and reduced to just a third of its original length, but he'd brought it along anyway. He wasn't fully sure why, a part of it was just habit, maybe a bit of it was because he'd hoped it'd have kept any discussion of how it broke from popping up, and maybe a bit was pure sentimentality, as while it was useless now, the sword was still something of a marker for a pretty big turning point in his life. He drew it out for a moment to show it, then put it back in his sheath as he nodded, not sure what to say. Apparently, no words were required, for Urahara's smile simply widened after his nod as he went on. That's as I thought. So, since you don't have your Zanpakuto anymore, I wanted you to try out these. As he said so, he pushed forward one of the many crates that littered his back room, opening it to reveal that 3 different katana were inside of it. Ichigo frowned at the sight. As soon as the lid had been removed, he could feel the power inside of each one, none as powerful as Sode no Shirayuki, he was pretty sure of that, but each one also clearly a fully awakened Zanpakuto, not just an empty Auswell. Orium's eyes glittered at the sight, as she leaned forward and said, sounding eager. Oh. Are we all going to become samurai too, freezing things like Ichigo was? That'd be so cool. A buzzing raised from her head as the 4 of her fairies that were with her started to complain about how that was unfair, which resulted in a bout of Orium apologizing while also trying to explain that she didn't mean she'd put them aside, but Ichigo's thought went into an entirely different direction. He glared at Urahara and said, trying really hard to keep the accusatory tone from his voice but not entirely succeeding. I thought Aizen said the Auswell I had been given was the first prototype. What are these then? And which Shinigami was willing to let you simply steal their power like that to just hand it out? Because these had to be new, there was no way Urahara had this stuff at hand and not handed it over to them back when they'd been in greater need of it before the fight with the Vizard if he'd had it back then, was there? Apparently, he was wrong, as Urahara shook his head, raising his hands as if asking for patience as he explained. These aren't Owswall, I don't think there's more of those, and even if there was I wouldn't know, because that's a project Captain Eisen developed on his own in Soul Society. No, these are actual awakened Zanpakuto, except they are lacking a connection. How is that possible? And why didn't you bring this up before? We could have used the help against the Vizard. Tatsuki and Orium both almost died there. Urahara shook his head. You know why we didn't give everybody Zanpakuto, Rukia told you, didn't she? That's because it'd take too long to form a connection, but if these already have a connection. He trailed off, suddenly realizing what it meant that the swords were available, despite having already established a connection to somebody else. Urahara's smile had disappeared, and his next nod was far more somber. Yes. The previous holders of these swords died. That made Orium stop her bickering with her fairies. Ichigo also went silent, considering the matter, before a sudden thought occurred to him, forming a frown on his forehead. If a Zanpakuto retains its soul when the Shinigami that created the connection dies, then wouldn't the sword be redistributed to other Shinigami? If nothing else, it'd make training people faster, since they'd not need to develop a connection of their own, merely take over a pre-existing one. And if so, why would you have these? Shouldn't whoever's in charge of arming your new recruits be holding onto them? Urahara shook his head. That's not how it works. Why not? How best to explain it? Do you know about Bankai? In detail, I mean. Ichigo nodded. This one was easy enough. It's a power released by a Zanpakuto when it achieves a perfect fusion with its wielder, born of their close bond, and granting great power. It's not that hard to remember, but why does it matters? Urahara let out a long breath. Because from our studies, reaching for Bankai is far more common than most Shinigami realize, or at least, a Zanpakuto and wielder attempting to do so is. Most don't succeed, let's put it that way. Do you have any idea what the consequences for a botched attempt at achieving Bankai are? Ichigo could remember Sode no Shirayuki's explanation on the matter quite clearly, so he simply nodded, which caused Urahara to continue. So I don't think you'll be surprised to know that whenever such a thing is attempted and fails, the results are generally the destruction of both involved souls, Shinigami and Zanpakuto. And there is another thing I discovered in my own research. Often, when the wielder of an awakened Zanpakuto found themselves in a situation that would cause their death if they were defeated, the Shinigami will try to force the fusion, or the Zanpakuto will offer it despite not being confident of their own success. And the result is, almost invariably, the destruction of both. Ichigo felt his blood go cold at the explanation, even as Urahara shook his head and said, I'm not holding back from reaching for Bankai without a reason. I studied the process, and if either the Shinigami or the Zanpakuto aren't fully ready, it ends in disaster. It might look like a last resort, but in truth it's just a desperation move, and like most actions motivated by desperation, it tends to fail. Ichigo nodded, then he moved his gaze to the sword in the chest in front of him with a new understanding. So, if these Zanpakuto are awakened, but without a wielder, that means they built a connection strong enough with their wielder to give them a personality and power, yet when their Shinigami was in a life or death situation, and trying for a Bankai might have saved them. They left their wielders to die rather than risk being destroyed alongside them, yes. Or, that would be traditional wisdom, at any rate. Not very reassuring anymore, is it? To weaklings, perhaps. To me, it just seems that these swords got the right idea. If the weaklings wielding them couldn't win without their power, they didn't deserve to have them is what I say. Urahara's next words, ironically, expressed a similar opinion to Ichigo's inner hollow, even if motivated by very different feelings. Of course, a less traditional position would be to praise these swords for knowing what their limits, and those of their wielder, were, but I suppose that's not very common. Ichigo wasn't sure what to think of that, so he focused on the most important point. I get why most people wouldn't want to try and use them, but surely that's not everybody, is it? And why not let us at least try? Because the other problem, which I discovered when I managed to find a few voluntaries willing to try it, is that connecting to the sword isn't at all easy. In fact, what few test cases I had seemed to suggest that it's even harder than usual, and thus more time-consuming, because the Zanpakuto resist the attempt to forge a connection. Sometimes, violently so. If that's true, then why are you telling me all of this? Ichigo couldn't see what Urahara's plan here was, but luckily the scientist was more than willing to explain it, the grin back on his face. Because you're unlike any other candidate I had before, you're the only person I know who has managed to forge a connection with a Zanpakuto that was bound to somebody else. That didn't seem right to Ichigo. It wasn't like Sode no Shirayuki had had any other opportunities to interact with the world other than helping him. I don't know that it's that great an achievement when the Zanpakuto was basically my captive at that time. Urahara chuckled, then answered. Captain Aizen might not have shown me all the research data for that project, since I wasn't involved in its development, but I did help you train with it, and had some talks with Rukia on the matter as well. You said it yourself, that initially you could access the Zanpakuto's Shikai against its will, but after you started to work with it, the Zanpakuto started to help you of its own free will. You even made a point of it to the captain, as I remember, that you did not force the sword to obey you, and rather managed to gain its trust and get it to help you on your own. The man then tapped the chest filled with swords, and continued. These swords lack a connection of their own. If anything, getting one of them to accept you as its new partner should be easier than it was to get Rukia's Zanpakuto to work alongside you. Thinking back of what it had took to earn Sode no Shirayuki's support, Ichigo answered wryly. I think you might be underestimating the difficulty and danger of such a task. Urahara waggled his finger at that. Hey now, this isn't a task, I'm not putting you up to anything. You said you wanted to thank me, and I said this is a way you could, but if you don't feel up to it, that's fine. I've been waiting a whole century to be able to restart this particular research project, and it would make me happy if you helped me with it, but an unwilling test subject is worse than useless. You can't trust your result if you can't trust the test subject to be honest about them. This is no exchange I'm proposing here. I'll keep you informed over what's going on with Rukia's process anyway. It really is up to you. You should tell him to throw himself off a cliff. He's just trying to goad you into destroying yourself because he knows I will eventually take you over and make you my vessel. You shouldn't trust him. Ichigo couldn't help the sense of amusement at the Hollow's word just after it had openly admitted that it wanted to subsume Ichigo and make him a puppet. That's why you can trust me, because I'm honest about my goals. Shaking his head to push the invasive presence of the Hollow away, Ichigo focused on the swords in front of him, settling into a contemplative mood. It wasn't an easy nor simple thing that Urahara was asking of him, but he did felt that he had to make amends for losing his temper somehow, and he wasn't blind to the fact that, if he could figure out a way to connect with these swords, not only would he get the power of a Zanpakuto back for himself, but he might be able to help his friends achieve the same, too. It would mean a lot more safety for all of them, assuming he could make it work. It's so sad, isn't it? Ichigo turned around at Orium's comment, and seeing his confusion, she clarified. The swords, they have their own souls, so they're like people, I think. I just felt it is sad, that their best friend left them, and they've been left all alone, with nobody to rely on, for all this time. That gave Ichigo pause. He hadn't considered it like that, but in a sense, what Orium was saying was true. They might be a source of power, but Zanpakuto were more than mere tool. In a way, they were people too. He could feel his inner Hollow preparing himself to deliver a scathing comment on the matter, so he forced his emotions down by distracting himself with a few soft words to the girl at his side. They probably do. You think they need a new friend, don't you? She nodded with energy as she said. Of course. Everybody need friends, life is way too boring and said otherwise. Maybe, but they lost their friends, what right do I have to take their place? I might be nothing like them. Orium's hand squeezed his shoulder in a reassuring manner as she said. Ichigo, you're brave, compassionate, and the kind of loyal that one can depend on. I think everybody would be lucky to have you as a friend. You're just cool, you know? You should give yourself a chance. That got a chuckle out of Ichigo. You think too highly of me, Orium. Orium hummed at that, then said, sounding amused. Or maybe you think too little of yourself. He shook his head, then turned to Urahara and said, in a more serious tone. All right then, I'm willing to try this out, but even if it works, it'll take time to get some results. Well, not as much time, you know I can take care of that problem. He tapped his sword cane on the floor to emphasize his words, which caused Ichigo to raise an eyebrow in surprise as he instinctively commented. That would require that I let you use your sword on me again, wouldn't it? Yes, it would. I suppose it's just a matter of trust, isn't it? There was a certain curve to Urahara's smirk, and Ichigo realized that, in truth, this was the real apology Urahara wanted, for Ichigo to prove he was willing to trust him again, if only just a bit. For a moment, he considered saying no, but then Rukia and Orium's words came back to him, and as he reached for a blade from the chest he said, letting determination enter his voice. I guess it is. Chapter 33, Cooperation. I brought cookies. Rukia looked up to see the figure of her friend Momo entering the corridor, carrying a trail of what looked like some sort of golden biscuits. She couldn't help but let her disbelief show on her face at the sight. They allowed you to bring me food that wasn't pre-approved. Why thank you Momo, that's so nice of you. Oh, it was nothing dear friend, no problem at all. Rukia chuckled at Momo's annoyed tone. I am grateful. I'm just surprised, that's all. These visits are already not something I was expecting to happen, let alone for you to be allowed to bring sweets along. Well, I am here to ensure you're not mistreated, and forbidding you from eating something this good would be a horrible mistreatment, don't you agree? Rukia laughed openly at that, Momo soon joining in before she sat in front of the cage and placed the trail in front of herself, so that Rukia could reach it as well. She took one of the cookies, finding them perhaps even better than she remembered them being, before asking with a smile. I think to keep them from anybody who has tasted one before would be torture, but really, I was just curious how you got the guards to agree to it. Momo shrugged and answered. Bribery, that's how. I brought 2 trails, and let them choose which one I would bring you while they kept the other, so they would know I wasn't hiding anything to help you escape within. Rukia could feel her eyes widening in disbelief at that. Momo didn't have a devious bone in her body, she tended to be sweet and kind in a very direct way. She could be very serious at times, and when she focused was a terrifyingly smart person, probably more than herself, in Rukia's own opinion, but it tended to be limited to constrained situation where she was working within fixed boundaries. When dealing with people, she just did not have much skill in reading their reactions, or with using subtlety in general, rather preferring to just avoid conflict altogether. It made her very pleasant company, but it did mean that she was not the person Rukia would expect such an idea to come from. That sounds very underhanded for you. How did you come up with such an idea? I totally can think of underhanded tricks. Although in this case it was Kira's suggestion. Rukia smiled at that, that made far more sense. While Izuru Kira wasn't all that socially adept himself, it was more due to self-doubt than a lack of ability to read people or notice things. He would easily be able to think of something like this, if he found himself in the need. It was nice, in a sense, to know that the introverted man considered Rukia enough of a friend to treat this situation as worth that kind of effort. Momo relaxed at Rukia's smile, then took an hand into hers and said, sounding really sad. I'm sorry you have to go through this, Rukia, I know that it can't be easy, with your brother and all. Is there anything I can do to help you? She clasped her friend's hand in return, squeezing it softly as she answered. Just you being here is enough, really. Don't worry, Captain Aizen has everything in hand, I'll be out of here very soon. I know, but... She trailed off, and Rukia had to hide her own smile. She admired Captain Aizen's intelligence, but that was nothing compared to the almost worship of him that Momo had. It was incredibly rare for Momo to express anything but total praise for Aizen's decisions. That she was even entertaining the thought here was worth a lot to Rukia. Still, she couldn't really let her friend feel down like this, so she decided to bring the matter in the open. You think that Captain Aizen should have asked you to do this, isn't it? Momo huffed at that. He should have. I mean. Momo stumbled, which Rukia knew was because she'd been about to say that Captain could trust her more than anyone, which would implicitly mean Rukia wasn't as worthy. She'd gotten caught between insulting Rukia and Captain Aizen, something which was typical of what her problem with socializing was. Rukia had expected it, seen it coming really, and so she deftly ignored the tiniest hint of jealousy that she could perceive in Momo's aura. She knew it wasn't honestly meant, after all, and instead said, reassuringly. You mean, he could trust you as much as he could me? Momo, Captain Aizen knows this. But, why, then? Why put you in such a position, when you already have to work so hard to keep your brother's regard? It'd have been easier for me. And I am the second seat, while you're the fourth, shouldn't that mean that I should be the one taking the riskier tasks? Rukia stroked Momo's hand to help her friend calm down, even as she said. That's why sending you would be too risky. People from all level of the division come to you for help or direction. I'm the field tester, my absences would be much easier to explain away. That's why Captain Aizen chose me for this task, not because he doubted you, Momo. Her friend let out a long breath, and Rukia could feel her soul quieting, a proof she'd managed to calm her down, as she eventually said. I know you're right, Rukia, but still. I feel guilty that you're suffering because of me. Maybe if I'd been less high profile, he could have sent me, and you would have been fine. Rukia didn't say to her friend that there was never a chance she could have been chosen. It wasn't so much that Momo was a much more important cog in making the 12th Division's machine work properly than Rukia, although that was part of it. It was that sending Momo would, almost certainly, have alerted the spy to Captain Aizen's plans. Of course, both the captain and Rukia herself knew Momo couldn't be the spy. None of Rukia's group of friends could be, since all five of them, Rukia, Momo, Renji, Izuru, and Toshiro, had not even been born 1 century ago, when the whole event with the Vizard had taken place. The big problem was that 2 of them were members of the 3rd Division, and in particular Momo's best friend, Toshiro Ichiguya, was Jin Ichimaru's lieutenant. Rukia being unreachable for some time was not that unusual and would have gone by without comment, but if Momo had been the one to go, Toshiro would almost certainly have shown up at the research team's headquarters to ask about her, and given how much Toshiro trusted Jin, the possibility of him bringing the matter up to the man and thus alerting their enemies to what was going on would have been too high. When Captain Aizen had explained it to her, Rukia could see how he was indeed correct, and why she was truly the best choice for the job. Still, telling all of this to Momo would quite ruin the whole point of it all, so instead Rukia chose to redirect the discussion. Also, she was genuinely curious about it as well, which helped. So, you've managed to keep your place over Nimue while I was away? I doubt Lieutenant Kuratsuka was happy about that. When I left, he was hoping that your cooperative project would prove that she was the better scientist. Kuratsuka Nimue was the 3rd seat of their division and Mayuri's daughter, and everybody knew that she'd been the subject of an experiment meant to exponentially increase the recipient's physical capabilities, especially intelligence. From what Rukia understood, which wasn't much, given the project was still top secret and beyond her clearance level, he'd only been authorized because the child had a condition that would have seen her die otherwise, but regardless, it was clear the project had worked to some extent. While not as young as Toshiro, who was younger than the rest of Rukia's group by a long shot, Nimue was nonetheless younger than Nimue and Rukia, and yet already their equal. Many spoke of her as a prodigy, and said she was aloof and unapproachable due to it, but Rukia, who had her brother as a comparison of what aloofness really looked like, found that she liked the other girl, despite her somewhat reserved and silent personality. Yeah, Mayuri complained, but Captain Aizen did say that my contribution to the latest project were greater than Nimue's, so I'm keeping my rank. She then frowned a bit and added, for now, at least. Rukia was surprised by that comment. It wasn't like Momo to doubt herself so. She tended to consider Nimue something of a rival, and enjoyed the competition with her, saying that it spurred her to make new progress. Generally, after one of her wins over the other girl, she tended to be proud, not contemplative. Why do you say that? Her friend let out a long breath, then explained, halfway between honestly sad and genuinely awed. She's just so much smarter. While Captain Aizen judged that I contributed more to the project, he later told me in private that it was a matter of quantity, more than quality, that I had done more work, and that if we had left it all to Nimue, it would have taken twice as long, but also that the sections Nimue worked on showed a deeper understanding and some innovative procedures that he suggested I implement in my project. He said it as a way to help me improve. You know how he is, and he also suggested to Nimue that she should find a way to organize her work better. But I only managed to complete my work as fast as I did because so many people in the division like me better than Nimue, and helped me, while they wouldn't have helped her, it wasn't any superior organization that made me win. She's just so much sharper, and I don't know that I can keep up anymore. She keeps coming up with new fields of experimentation to explore all the time, and I have trouble finding new procedures to tackle what's already there. Rukia knew that merely telling Momo she was being too harsh on herself would not help, so she told her instead, in a hopeful tone. Well, just you wait until I'm out of here, and I'll help you find something new to keep improving on. I bet there's plenty of possibilities in the field of integrating Kido with traditional Reishi tools that neither Nimue nor any other member of the division has explored before. Then you'll be feeling like a pioneer again. Momo's expression changed to a smile as she shot back, amused. Nobody has explored that because nobody in our division is anywhere as good with Kido as you are. You really belong to the Kido Corps, not the research team, you know that, right? Rukia stole the cookie Momo was reaching for at that and said, pointing it toward her. Are you saying I am not fit to be a scientist? I'll have you know that I've contributed a lot of new technological projects to the division. Momo laughed. They had, after all, worked on about 2/3 of those projects together, especially when Rukia was still new to the research team and needed to learn the ropes and the procedures, and raised her hands in surrender. All right, I'm sorry for that. I'll concede that I don't know anybody, other than Captain Aizen, that can keep up with you when you start going into the deeper intricacies of Kido. Not even Mayuri, I think. In fact, I believe he's even sometimes jealous of you because of that, you know. Rukia shrugged. Mayuri's antipathy for her was nothing new, and something she reciprocated deeply. She was still pretty sure that he was Jin's spy in the 12th Division, and couldn't wait for this whole farce of a process to be over so she could start investigating the matter seriously now that she was back in Soul Society. That was when a sudden idea came to her. She grabbed 3 or 4 cookies as she asked, her tone as casual as she could manage it. So, the captain didn't really tell you anything about the mission I was on, right? Momo shook her head. Not really, he said he couldn't disclose anything before the process, something about information security. Rukia nodded, even as she started to break the cookies in her hands into small little pieces, before letting the crumbles fall on the trail. Momo's eyes widening as Rukia said, continuing to keep her nonchalant tone. That makes sense, really, there's not that many people Captain Aizen can trust with it. I see. So you understand the needs for discretion, I hope. Naturally. I'm glad. Really, it's only prudent. I suppose you're right. Still, there is something I want to make clear. What? That I trust you, Momo. And I'm sure Captain Aizen does too. Thank you, Rukia. As she had after every sentence, Rukia waited until Momo's nod confirmed that she'd read the message she had written with the cookie crumbs before going for them, except this time, rather than rearranging them into new words for Momo to read as she spoke, she scooped them up and ate them all. Even like that, they were still good. She exchanged a look with Momo to make sure they were on the same page, before finally settling down as she moved to make some light conversation and finally take advantage of this chance to relax that she'd been given. So, how is everybody doing? I'm kinda surprised Renji hasn't yet shown up to shout at the guards so he can come be a bother, to be honest. Oh, that would be because your brother has put him on punishment duty in the mortal realm. I don't know how long it'll be before he can come back. Really? What did he do this time? Rukia lost herself in small talk with Momo for what was likely less than an hour, but felt like so much more. When her friend left, Rukia's spirit had been lifted by the visit. Not to mention that Momo, while still not knowing why, would start preparing her Shinigami friends for the investigation Rukia wanted to carry out to finally discover what was going on, and prove to her other, newer friends that all the work they'd done had been in favor of the right thing. She owed it to them all, and herself too, to find out the truth. Ichigo frowned after handing off 2 of the swords back to Urahara, while keeping for himself a sword that had a rectangular, bronze-colored tsuba with a stylized flame pattern along the sides, red wrapping around the handle and 2 light blue tassels attached to its pommel. The metal of the blade seemed to glint silvery in the dark, which was different from both the black of his now broken Oswal and the white of a released Sode no Shirayuki in a way that Ichigo couldn't help but find reassuring. Urahara observed the sword with curiosity as he took the other 2 back and asked, sounding curious. Why that one? Ichigo tried to find a way to explain it, and finally settled on the simplest explanation he could give. It's just the one I have the best chance to connect with. Of the three, it's the one with the personality least likely to reject me. Really? How could you tell? I was under the impression these swords were trying to hide their emotional state. They were, Ichigo could tell that. And when he'd tried to connect, all he'd felt was a powerful maelstrom of repulsion pushing him away, regardless of whichever sword he'd tried to. However, when he'd tried to see if using the Ryotsu leaking from the points where his soul was still finishing to heal from being stitched together would cause any different reactions, it had worked better than he expected it to. It had taken a moment for Ichigo to realize that, since his inner hollow had been helping in keeping his soul together, the Ryotsu in those points was heavily contaminated, and when coming in contact with this Ryotsu that was more hollow-like, each of the Zanpakuto, as weapons created to destroy hollows, had shown an almost instinctive reaction to it that had been quite telling. In one case it was hatred, in another pity, but the last one had caught Ichigo's attention, because before it had been able to shield itself, the sword had revealed a flash of sudden curiosity. It wasn't much to go on, but Ichigo felt like it was his best bet to make this work. Explaining all of that to Urahara, however, would make it seem like he was going off a hunch, which, in a sense, he was, but that didn't seem very scientific to him. So he said instead, with a shrug. They reacted in different manners to my scan, that's all. I think I'm ready to try this thing out, so. Wait. Can I take one for myself then? Urahara and Ichigo both turned to Orium, with the former raising an eyebrow as he said, perplexed. You have an idea on how to connect with a Zanpakuto faster than usual. When Orium shook her head, Urahara's confusion grew. Then why do you want one? Because they need a friend. I said it before, didn't I? Who cares how long it takes, if at the end they'll at least be happy for a bit. Urahara didn't seem to have an answer to that, so he shrugged and offered the swords to Orium. Before his friend could choose, he pointed her to the sword with a flower-shaped golden tsuba and a handle wrapped in blue, the one that had felt pity for his infected Ryotsu, saying, I think you'll get along better with this one. Orium's smile was huge as she took the sword, hugging it, which caused Ichigo to just shook his head in amusement before he offered his arm to Urahara, who nodded before unsheathing his own sword, Sakanade. As the purple energy charged around the thin blade, he warned Ichigo, as he always did. This will make every hour you spend under it be as long as a day for you. Remember, even if while out of your body your soul will last far longer, it still requires sustenance, so you'll need to take breaks after every 2 days of subjective time. Is that clear? After the second time he'd trained with Urahara, Ichigo had asked if he could skip repeating the warning every time, to which the man had answered with a grin that it was important to ensure proper caution was observed whenever performing experiments. Personally, Ichigo just thought he did it to be annoying, but since arguing over the matter would be pointless, he merely nodded, and with a motion of Urahara's sword, a scarf of glowing purple energy wrapped itself around Ichigo's arm, causing his perceptions to slow down. He closed his eyes then, and then focused on what was going to be the hard part. As he focused on the power of his inner hollow, the moment he did, the creature's laugh echoed in his thoughts, mocking. So, once again, you come to me for the power to accomplish that of which you are incapable of on your own. Why should I help you? After all, isn't it your plan to use the spirit within this sword to better control me? Of course, the hollow was correct. However, Ichigo thought he had something that could work, if he understood the creature correctly. So he ignored the mocking tone entirely, letting instead a sense of disappointment shine through. So, you're saying that you would be more powerful on your own, than you would be working together with me like we could when we had a Zanpakuto to help as well. I have no need for power that isn't entirely mine. I would not be more powerful, you would be. I thought you said you were planning to make my power into yours. Why would that matter? I'm more than powerful enough already. Are you? And here I was, thinking you might want revenge on the guy who beat us. Ichigo could feel the hollow's emotions going still and quiet, surprise overpowering everything else the creature was feeling for a while. Eventually, a certain eagerness filled the creature, but there was also a substantial amount of disbelief there. You would let me kill the brother of your friend? Do you think I'm an idiot, to believe that? Probably not kill, but why would you think I'd be opposed to giving the man a good trashing? But you saw how he handled us last time, we can't beat him as we are now. He used a surprise attack, if we were prepared, it'd not have been that easy. The other captain we faced beat us both easily enough, and Rukia's brother seemed stronger to me. The Hollow didn't answer immediately to that, its emotions in turmoil, but Ichigo limited himself to wait and, soon enough, a certain smugness overtook everything. Alright then, this might just be worth trying. How do you plan to make the sword that wants nothing to do with you actually agree to work with you? Just lend me your power, and leave the rest to me, it'll work. He felt the Hollow relinquish a large amount of its own Ryotsu, and as soon as it did, Ichigo focused, since this wasn't something he'd ever tried before. He sent out the Ryotsu in the sensory pulse that Fullbringer used, except that he used Hakuta to charge it with a feeling of need, which would make it penetrate the shield of emotions surrounding the Zanpakuto more easily, hopefully raising the sword's curiosity in seeing the power of a Hollow used to fuel an ability typical of Shinigami. And indeed, after a few moments, the spirit of the sword reacted, initially trying to push away Ichigo's pulse. However, Ichigo didn't let that stop him, drawing on his inner Hollow's huge amount of Ryotsu to leave out more and more pulses. He even made sure to fire them at a regular interval, hoping that this would make the sword even more curious about what was going on. Ichigo's goal was to make the Zanpakuto more receptive and open up the emotional shield it was wrapped into to let Ichigo establish a connection, so he was surprised when, instead, the spirit within the soul reached out, apparently trying to reach over to Ichigo on its own. After the initial moment of surprise, Ichigo made sure to lower his own defenses, but the sword's emotions didn't seem able to reach him. He felt stumped for a moment, but then remembered how he'd used the Owl's to draw Sode no Shirayuki in, and tried to replicate the same feeling. Without the tool's guidance, it was not that easy, but after a few failed attempts, Ichigo managed to replicate the sensation, feeling that he was doing it the right way. As he grasped for the proffered emotions with his own, Ichigo realized that he would not be able to actually do this if the sword wasn't offering the connection itself. Not only wasn't it a stable connection like he'd had with Sode no Shirayuki, he was also sure that he couldn't even push or draw in any emotions along it, meaning it would be completely useless for use in combat. Still, it would allow him to speak directly with the spirit of the Zanpakuto, and that was what he needed right now. When he opened his eyes, he was back inside his mind. Although he noticed that the surroundings were slightly different, he was still on the rooftops of one of many skyscrapers that made up a city, but instead of hail and snow, only rain was falling from the sky. He wondered if the previous appearance had been influenced by the presence of Sode no Shirayuki, but before he could think of it any further, he focused on the new, powerful presence that was drawing all of his attention. The first thing Ichigo noticed about the Zanpakuto spirit was that it looked ragged. It had long black hairs that fluttered in the wind, wore a long, tattered black cloak, and despite being a man far taller than Ichigo, possibly as big as Chad even, he looked like he was steeped and hunched on himself without actually being so, as if he was carrying some impossibly heavy weight on his shoulder. He was also standing balanced on the tip of a flagpole that Ichigo was pretty sure hadn't been there the last time he'd been in his inner world, but given how much the hail being replaced by rain made the place look different, he couldn't swear on it. Still, it made for an impressive introduction. Ichigo focused his emotion and straightened his posture, then went to introduce himself. I am a kid, arrogant and certain you know better than your elders. That left Ichigo frowning, and he shot back, annoyed. Nobody forced you to talk to me, I was just trying to be polite. You were just trying to get something you haven't earned, is what I think. I have no interest in your name, and I certainly wouldn't give mine in return. Ichigo calmed himself down, then nodded. A Zanpakuto's name was key to invoking their powers, after all. Then he said, trying to keep his annoyance at how he'd been addressed in check. That's fair, but still, there is a reason you decided to talk to me. You were being annoying, as squalling children are wont to be. I just wanted to shut you up. That left Ichigo perplexed. He knew the sword spirit was only talking to him because of pure curiosity, so there had to be some questions he wanted to ask. Such hostility didn't really make sense in that context, not unless, Ichigo realized, the Zanpakuto also wanted to test him. He might be curious, but clearly not so curious as to lower himself to ask question of somebody he didn't respect. Prideful then, enough so as to put it above his personal interests, Ichigo could sympathize with that. He just needed the spirit to do the same for him, and as far as Ichigo was concerned, the only way to earn respect was to prove himself worthy of it. He didn't know what attitude would get to the old man, but in that moment, he also didn't care. If he couldn't get the spirit to respect him for who he really was, there was no point in doing anything else, for they could never truly work together. So he just said what he had on his mind, letting his emotion show through as he spoke. I was asking for help. Maybe that sounded like crying to you, but to me, that's just recognizing one's fault, and looking to surpass them. I can't do it on my own, but I thought you might be interested in helping me. That caused the man to raise an eyebrow in surprise at Ichigo's directness. And you don't feel any shame in asking for help? For such weakness. If one doesn't acknowledge their own weaknesses, how can they ever overcome it? The only way to gain strength is to recognize you need it in the first place. Is that so? And yet I think you already have somebody to help you with it, don't you? The man pointed a finger to a point in the rooftop Ichigo was standing on, which, Ichigo realized, was also new. Instead of a trapdoor, a small cabin had formed on the rooftop, with a door of black steel on it, close, but no longer locked. Before Ichigo could even answer, the door was slammed open from the inside, and from what looked like a set of stairs heading downwards into the darkness, the familiar figure of a massive creature with a white mask with red stripes, curved horns and glowing golden eyes emerged from it, a rumbling chuckle roiling out of its throat. Oh, I shall help him indeed. Why, I helped him lure you here, after all. Have you come to become my next meal? I confess that I've never eaten a Zanpakuto spirit, but don't worry, I'm always open to trying new foods, it keeps the afterlife entertaining. The man scoffed, his eyes focused on the hollow, keeping its every movement under careful watch, even as his next words were addressed to Ichigo. Is that so? Have you brought me here for this creature to eat, so that you can use my power through your control over him? Ichigo shook his head and answered. No. He might lend me his power occasionally, but he's not my ally, he only does it because he plans to take over my body someday. I don't plan on letting him do it, all I need is your help. So he is to be a threat then. I help you, or you sick this monster on me. Is that your plan, kid? Ichigo shook his head. If I need to extort you, then it'd not be true help. I know the difference between a Zanpakuto giving you their power willingly and one that is being forced to, and I have no use for the latter. If you will help me of your own free will, I'd be grateful, but if you'd only do it because of a threat, then you should just leave. The Zanpakuto spirit turned his eyes toward Ichigo at his declaration, and the same did his inner hollow, although, while the first looked surprised and, once again, curious, the second looked annoyed, the rage in its glowing eyes stronger and more powerful than before. You said that we needed the power of a Zanpakuto to face off against that bastard, and now you give up on it so easily? I didn't thought you one of those weaklings I so despise, but if this is the extent of your willpower to right a wrong you've received, I might just decide to take over on the spot. Ichigo didn't let the hollow's fury scare him, instead focusing his Ryutsu around himself. He didn't have a proper sword, but he did have the remains of the Auswall at his side, or a spiritual representation of it, at any rate, so he drew the broken black sword and used Hakuta to wrap it around the blade, focusing all of his disdain for the hollow to give what little of it he had a proper edge. He knew it wouldn't be comparable to a proper sword, of course, but it was better than nothing, and even broken, it was still the same weapon he'd gone through so many hardship with. He trusted it would last long enough to let him keep his inner hollow in check until he could put him back in his closet. Before any battle could take place, however, the Zanpakuto spirit spoke up once more, distracting them both. That's an interesting technique you're using. I don't think I've ever seen a Shinigami use Hakuta to reinforce their sword before, but then, I'd never seen a Shinigami wielding a broken blade, or housing a hollow inside their soul, or even trying to gain the service of a Zanpakuto that had awakened for somebody else, rather than raising a sword of their own. What sort of strange kid are you, truly? And there was the curiosity. It was stronger than it had been when the spirit had first shown up. While it would have been nice to focus on that, Ichigo knew better than removing his eyes from his inner hollow, who still looked ready to attack even if it hadn't yet, but he did answer, letting a wry smile form on his lips at his circumstances. The least lucky in the world, most likely. I stumbled onto this hollow and the Shinigami chasing after him, who just so happened to have a tool that could pass off the power of her sword to me, only, instead of working properly, the sword also stuck this guy inside of me as well. Then I lost the sword, but the guy is still there, and more annoying than ever. Hence why I need help, to keep him in check. Those are some remarkably strange circumstances. While the Zanpakuto was still letting out primarily a sense of gruff annoyance at Ichigo, he could feel just the tiniest hint of awe in its voice, as if even the sword spirit itself couldn't believe such an improbable story. Ichigo tried to think of a way to communicate that he shared the same puzzlement to the matter, but then was distracted when his inner hollow's aggression suddenly vanished, as it let out another long, rumbling laugh that had more than a tinge of cruelty to it. Is that really what you think went down? Ichigo frowned at that, annoyed and confused both at the comment. What do you mean? I mean that it was no coincidence that I was chased to this particular town, nor was it random chance that it was your little Shinigami friend after me. That it was you in particular to stumble into us was the only randomness in what happened, that, and maybe the precise details of what powers you ended up having access to as a result. Everything else about it was planned, and make no mistake, it was just your bad luck to be the one who got ensnared into it, but if not you, somebody certainly would have been. The Hollow's words left Ichigo stumped for a moment, and by the time he'd recovered enough to have something to answer, the monster was already heading back down to its hideout. Still, Ichigo shouted, furious. What's the meaning of this? If you know something, then tell me. I don't think so, I already told you, didn't I? I'll only part with what I know if it's necessary, or if you cut me a deal I'm happy with. And I'm not really in the mood for deals right now, but if you want to make me change my mind, feel free to come down into my domain, maybe I'll tell you what I know if you defeat me. Assuming you can, that is. The Hollow finished disappearing into the darkness as it let out its parting comment. Ichigo knew that the inner Hollow really was just goading him, that losing a fight with the creature within his mind might well lead to the monster gaining full control of his body, but even so, he almost wanted to chase after him, even taking a step forward, before he could take more. However, he felt a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. Ichigo turned to watch the old man that was now towering over him, and after taking a deep breath and shaking his head, he managed to get his annoyance under control, before nodding in thanks to the Zanpakuto spirit. I'm sorry about that, I let my emotions get the better of me. You did, but I can understand the feeling of being trapped by forces you can neither control nor understand. It can lead one to make impulsive decisions, which are rarely the right ones. Ichigo was surprised by the words. He could sense that there was some sort of story for the Zanpakuto spirit there, something that, if he asked, might help him get the Zanpakuto's help. And with how the old man was opening up, it might be the best opportunity he could get to do it. But right then, immediately after what was basically a stranger had tried to comfort him and keeping him from doing something stupid he would regret, he didn't want to. It felt wrong, like a betrayal of sort, somehow. So, he instead focused on doing something else which, he realized, he should perhaps have opened this whole conversation with. You have my apologies, for dragging you here. It's just that I need somebody to help me get that creature under control, and I thought you would be interested with helping, that's why I bothered you so insistently. I understand it was egoistic of me, but I really have no ideas on what else I could do. The Zanpakuto spirit watched him in silence for a long moment, then gestured with his head to the broken Auswall still in Ichigo's hand. Is that the remains of your Zanpakuto? Ichigo looked down at the blade himself, a certain sadness coming onto him as he remembered all that it represented, and nodded. In a sense, yes, the Zanpakuto was never truly mine, but yes, the spirit was housed here while we were working together. And from what I understand, an opponent you couldn't beat, not even with the Hollow's help, is the one who broke it. Is that correct? Ichigo nodded, even as he sheathed it back, and the Zanpakuto spirit went on. Did the sword not offer you the chance to fuse with it to achieve Bankai, so you could win? Ichigo sensed the importance of the question. This, he realized, was where he could find common ground with the Zanpakuto spirit, something that might just persuade it to help. But he couldn't lie, not on something this important, so he shook his head. But he did elaborate, in a sad tone. That one was over too quickly. But, it did offered me, just a few days before, in similar circumstances. I refused, however, because I knew that it wouldn't work, that our bond wasn't strong enough for it to work. The old man seemed to consider that for another long moment, and then said, "Could you have died, due to refusing the Bankai? You clearly didn't, but could you have?" Ichigo couldn't help but let out a bark of humorless laughter at the question. "I certainly would have, if not for my friend saving me and allowing somebody else to save me at the last moment. There was no way I could have won that fight back then." "So, you would have died, rather than force a Bankai out of your sword, and now, you would rather risk to be devoured by that creature rather than force me to help you. Why is that, kid? Is it your wish to die? Are you suicidal?" Ichigo couldn't comprehend the question, delivered in such an impassive, uncaring tone, but after a moment, he could feel annoyance blossoming in his chest at the idea, and he said back, almost growling, "Why would I ever want to die? I have a family to protect, and friends who care about me, and people who need my help. I have a better life than many, and even if I didn't, it could always get better. I'm not going to throw in the towel when things get hard." He knew he was probably burning his chance of the Zanpakuto spirit ever working with him with a reaction like this to his accusation, but he didn't really care in the heat of the moment. If somebody couldn't understand a concept as simple as being willing to die to protect somebody's free will, he wasn't sure he actually wanted to work with them. In fact, he was just about to express that sentiment out loud, when the old man, from the first time since Ichigo had met him, smiled. There was no humor in it. In fact, it was one of the saddest smiles Ichigo had ever seen, and it was there and gone in a moment, but it left Ichigo confused on what was going on just long enough for the spirit to speak again. "All right. I shall give you a chance to prove yourself." "A chance? What do you mean?" "I will not let a true connection form between us. I do not trust you that far. However, I will let you have some of my power, and watch what use you make of it. And maybe, if I like the way you use it, I might give you more eventually. Your words earned you at least that much. As for whether you will prove worthy of it or not, that shall be only in your own hands." The spirit disappeared, but Ichigo could feel a weird sense of something being left behind. When he focused on it, he realized that, while he had no connection to the Zanpakuto still, the sword was leaving a few trails of emotional connection behind, just enough that, if he exercised his power like he had, copying the Oswald connection, he could reform the hesitant connection from before. He would not be able to draw power from the sword through a connection like that, and only be able to send his own power to it if the sword allowed it. He would not be to share control of his body with it, or have it direct his actions, and the sword could cut the connection at any moment from its side, even mid-battle, with no warning or way for Ichigo to keep it going. It was stupidly dangerous, and nowhere close to what a true connection between Zanpakuto and Shinigami should be like, and yet, Ichigo couldn't help but smile a bit at it. Tiny as it was, the connection felt true, somehow, in a way the one with Sode no Shirayuki never had. It really felt like a good start, as if to prove that he was taking the first step along the right path. Chapter 34, Learning. Tatsuki frowned as she watched the scales along her hand recede one by one, slowly revealing her skin underneath. It was a strange sensation, to watch the shimmering dark blue and black disappear in regular formation of one scale at a time, even while the feeling of it was like peeling out of some super adherent diving suit of sort. The tactile and visual experiences didn't match at all, and neither of the two paired well with what she perceived through her spiritual sense, according to which the cover was still in place over her entire body but slowly becoming thinner and thinner. They were her body and soul, she knew, nobody else but hers, and yet they felt alien in a deeply unpleasant manner. Excellent. I think you have the hang of forcing the hollow back by now. That's the most important part. I knew you had the instinct for it. Being stubborn to the extreme is the key to taming your inner hollow, and you've more than enough stubbornness in you that I'd name you an honorary 11th. Tatsuki raised her eyes, although not by much, since her teacher was far shorter than her in height, and once again reminded herself that she wasn't facing a middle schooler, but rather a deadly killer with over a century of experience on her. It was another thing about these lessons that Tatsuki wasn't sure how to handle. Hiyori both looked and sounded like a middle schooler, and was only when she started moving with the confidence of an experienced black belt that it became apparent she was not. Tatsuki was used to weird things by now, especially after her latest trainer had been a talking cat, but even so, she took a moment to remind herself that her newest teacher knew what she was talking about, and should be deferred to. Personally, However, Tatsuki had her doubts that Hiyori was correct. She could feel the monster inside her mind, and it didn't felt to her like the creature was tamed at all. It was a coil of tightly wound fury and overwhelming power kept in check by a desire of control that was terrifying. It felt like the monster wanted to control everything in the world, and the mere idea of being subject to another, of being bound, made the furious bonfire that the hollow held within herself grow stronger and bigger, ready to escape and destroy anything that would control her, while forcing everything else to let itself be controlled or burn. For such a force of nature to be so easily cowed by the mere fact of Tatsuki willing it felt wrong. Like she was being lulled into a false sense of security, like her inner hollow was merely pretending to be so easily called upon and sealed away by a twitch of Tatsuki's will. Still, in the end, she wasn't the expert. If she couldn't trust her teacher on this point, who would she trust? Thus she answered, in a hesitant tone that didn't really feel like her own. I suppose it must be so, but it feels like it's too easy. It feels like it should be much harder. She was glad when Hiyori didn't dismiss her worry, instead considering it for a long moment. You think your inner hollow is fooling you into thinking you're in control, only to catch you by surprise later. Is that it? Tatsuki nodded, ready to be chastised for not having full trust into Hiyori's opinion, but the other girl merely shrugged, scratching her chin before nodding and saying, "Yeah, that sound likely. Hollows are tricky beasts." "So what?" Tatsuki blinked, left completely dumbfounded, and Hiyori motioned with her hand in a go-on motion. "I should not care if I'm being tricked." "Precisely. See, I knew you'd get it." "I don't think I do, to be honest." Hiyori looked surprised by that, then huffed and explained. "You are looking at this from the wrong perspective. Let's say the hollow is pretending that you're in control, and playing some long game. Well, as long as it keeps playing its game, then you keep reaping the same benefits as if you actually were in full control." "But dash." Hiyori raised an hand to cut her objection short, continuing to speak with a determined glint in her eyes. "And when the time finally comes for it to try to take over and it fights you for real, you just need to win that one fight with it, and push it under your heel. That's why it doesn't matter if you have it truly under control or not, so long as it obeys, there is no real difference, and when the time comes for your trial by fire, you just need to win. If you believe in your ability to win that fight when you have to fight it, there's absolutely nothing you need to worry about." Tatsuki let out a long breath. She tried to keep her doubt out of her voice, but she didn't think she managed to do it fully. "I hope you're right." "Hey. None of that." "What?" "The defeatism. That's 4th Division talk, and I don't want any of it here. When you want something to go your way, you don't hope that it does, you make it go your way. I know you're better than this, that's why I picked you as a student in the first place. Where is the grit that had you push past your limits to beat Mashiro, Pull some of that out." Tatsuki wasn't so sure that was a good idea, seeing as the last time she'd ended up with a monster stuck into her head. Still, she nodded, mustering her determination. She might not be sure if it was a good idea, but she wouldn't know if she didn't try first. "Right, sorry about that." "It's fine, but no apologizing either. You must own your will to be strong." "I will, I promise." Hiyori grinned, punching her on her shoulder strong enough to feel as if she'd been stung, but her master grin made it clear it had been meant in good cheer. "That's the spirit. Besides, you must learn to make the most of what you have, even if it turns out you aren't yet strong enough to quickly seal away the inner hollow. You can just do like me, and only use a partial awakening until you're strong enough to keep it under control." Tatsuki was left shocked by that for a moment, then asked, to confirm she hadn't misheard. "You aren't strong enough to control your monster?" "Not yet." Hiyori raised a finger to emphasize her point, then went on to explain, in a serious tone. "My inner hollow is about 3 times as powerful as your own, which is already well above average. I have been working on either getting rid of it or, failing that, pulling it under my control, but it's a very slow-going process and it doesn't cooperate at all." Tatsuki frowned. That didn't sound encouraging at all. "What if my hollow doesn't cooperate either?" "Your hollow's not as much of a pain to handle as mine." That sounded like an excuse to her. It seemed like the other girl was making excuses over her inability to do something that she expected Tatsuki to be able to learn to do on her own. She didn't say anything, but her supposed master frowned nonetheless, and it took a moment for Tatsuki to realize that her emotions were showing in her soul. She'd forgotten that happened, and tried to focus on calming herself and hiding what she was feeling from detection. Before she could do much with it, however, Hiyori interjected, a note of tiredness in her voice. It's not like you think. I can suppress my inner hollow very fast, if I want to, I just can't keep it from interfering when in battle. My hollow's power is to explode. How does that works? It fires off bombs. No, it literally is a bomb, and a powerful one at that. The first time it used its powers, back when it was first sealed into me and I had no control, it wiped out the entire sector of Rukonga we were standing into. It explodes and then regenerates itself, that's all it can do, but it's really quite effective. And all it needs to do in order to unleash this power is to resist me for the tiniest of moments, since that's enough for it to trigger the explosion. That's why I limit myself to partial releases. The stupid thing cheats. Instead of being able to fight it for control like everybody else, I need to keep it fully submitted, all the time, without ever lapsing. It's totally unfair, and I'm not good enough to do it. There was clear frustration in Hiyori's voice as she explained the trouble with her hollow, but then she seemed to recover, closing her fist in determination as she said. But that's only for now, it won't be like this forever. It's only a matter of time before I subdue it completely. I know it, and it does too, I just need to keep at it, and believe me, I will. Tatsuki understood her master's point better now. While she was still doubtful, it did sound like Hiyori's grievances were at least somewhat legitimate. Still, she couldn't help herself from asking, a bit of doubt still in her voice. And you don't think the same applies to me, right? Hiyori didn't sound offended, if anything, she seemed amused. Of course it doesn't. Your hollow's power is destructive, sure, but it takes time to ramp up, and as soon as you have your hollow back under control, you can even reverse its effects. You just need a strong enough will to keep the hollow from getting absolute control, because if it has to fight you, then you can beat it. Just keep at it, be ready for its unavoidable attempt at escape, and keeping it suppressed will be well within your capabilities. Is that clear? Tatsuki didn't let the finger pointed at her intimidate her, instead merely answering, with as much conviction as she could manage. Of course. I'll do it. Good. Now we can start working on partial release. That's, when you only have the mask of the hollow, rather than transforming into it fully, right? Hiyori nodded, the self-satisfied grin on her face making it clear she was proud of Tatsuki. She wasn't sure why, since it wasn't like she'd said anything particularly insightful, but then again, Hiyori tended to be amused, excited, or annoyed by the weirdest things, so it was hard to say for certain. Yes, but that's just focusing on what it looks like, the important thing is what allows you to do. You realize the difference between a partial and full release, right? Tatsuki nodded, it wasn't that hard to do, once you'd experienced them both. The partial release had you covered with a sort of thin full bodysuit made of reishi, underneath which the hollow's ryotsu flowed, strengthening her body and increasing her ability to regenerate. The full release let out a ton more ryotsu, which flew through, around, and over the bodysuit, fusing itself with her soul. It was the difference between being under a shower and swimming underwater. Both had you surrounded by liquid, but the amount of liquid and control of your body that you had were deeply different. Good. Thus you understand what the advantage of the partial release is. I'm sure, you might have access to only a sliver of the power, but you have far more control over it. Then, once you have mastered the techniques in partial release, you can then make use of them in your full release as well, although that'll be harder. Which is why we'll be practicing in partial release. That sounded intriguing. Tatsuki hadn't considered there being anything more to the transformation than having greater strength and regeneration, but if there were details to learn, then she was curious. What techniques? There are 3, although one of those I can only describe, rather than show, since the only one who ever actually managed to use it is Shinji. He has both far better control and is carrying what is by far the weakest hollows among those sealed in us visored, so replicating it might be difficult. So, how do they work? Well, the first is Sonido. Tatsuki's eyes widened, she remembered that one, it was one of the moves the green-haired visored, Mashiro Kuna, had used to beat her. The speed trick, right? You're gonna teach me how it works. Of course, it's quite easy, really, just a matter of a bit of focus. You know how to manipulate Ryotsu already from using Hakuda, right? Hiyori waited for Tatsuki to nod, then continued good. So, what you need to do is focus on pushing a lot of the Ryotsu that's running under your coat to a single point of it, so it builds pressure, and then you let the coat break. The sudden release of pressure will create a jet of Ryotsu, and that can push you forward. And of course, greater control and more precision in the size and placement of the breach will make the movement that much more effective. She then showed it, the mask appearing on her faces for a fraction of a second before she exploded forward, fast as a cannonball, and then a moment later, she was back. Her mask disappeared thereafter, and she elaborated. Since it's so sudden, it gives you a boost of movement that is much faster than Shunpo. However, the farther you want to move, the more pressure you need to build up beforehand, and since it is so sudden, there's no precision to it, and you can't really correct your path mid-movement, other than by building up multiple at once. Tatsuki nodded, then a thought occurred to her as she asked. If you create a jet, then couldn't you use it as a ranged weapon, as long as you anchored yourself beforehand? Hiyori waved her hand in a so-so manner as she answered. Not really. It's not very powerful or precise, and since it's just sheer unchanged arced Ryotsu, it doesn't really carry any extra effect, so it's easy to block or deflect. What if you charged it? Hiyori looked thoughtful, as if considering the matter carefully, before giving her answer. That would require you to charge the Ryotsu after firing it, since if you did it before, it wouldn't explode out the way it's supposed to, and given how fast it moves, I don't see how you'd have the time to. Then Hiyori raised her finger and continued. Besides, it's not necessary, you see, if you just have your hollow purify it, then you change the jet of Ryotsu into a zero, which is unstoppable and devastating. That requires the hollow to cooperate with me though. Hiyori nodded to Tatsuki's right comment, looking completely unfazed by it. Most often, yeah, it does. On the other hand, in the end it's just a matter of purifying the Ryotsu as it is being fired. After experiencing it enough times, I've become good enough to do it by myself. So long as your hollow is powerful enough, which I know yours is, I'm sure you'll be able to, in time, and since Ryotsu used for the zero should be a permanent loss, eventually doing this you might even be able to get rid of your inner hollow entirely. I know that's what I am training this for. She then pointed her finger at Tatsuki and concluded. And thus, that's what we're going to be practicing now. How to use partial release and combine it with Sonito. It'll give you strength, speed and regeneration beyond what most Shinigami can ever reach, and when you combine it with your Hakuda, you'll really be able to kick some serious ass. I thought the goal was for me to get my monster under control. Of course, and that means kicking its ass, too. It's all part of the plan, you see. I see. If there was a certain bemusement in Tatsuki's voice and feelings, Hiyori clearly chose to ignore it, as she instead pulled out her sword from her back, although it was still sheathed, and tapped it to the ground in an excited manner. Alright then, you ready? Wait, before that, what are the other two abilities? Can you at least tell me, so I know? Hiyori looked surprised, but was quick to shrug. Sure, no problem with it, but they won't help much right now. The first is called Descorer, and it basically means focusing on the precise power fingerprint of your Ryotsu, which we call Ryoryoku, and manipulate it to match that of your hollow. It shouldn't be too hard for you, since Shinji already chosen hollow you had a strong resonance with, and once you can do that, you will be able to use your hollow's power. Thinking of the terrifying tornado of blue flames she'd had her hollow summon on her behalf during the battle, Tatsuki could see why that would be handy. Although, considering that, is there any difference between doing that and just making the hollow use it for you? Hiyori snorted, and looked at Tatsuki with a disappointed expression that made her feel embarrassed. It was rare for her teacher to display that kind of expression. She was normally very friendly and proud of Tatsuki's progress, so she hadn't expected it. It was unsettling in a way she couldn't easily explain. Obviously, if you can control your hollow's power as well as them, you can limit the damage they do if they take control, at least when the power is like yours rather than like mine. But more importantly, if you can control the power yourself, then when you use a full release, you can align yourself with the hollow, and that makes the hollow's power far stronger. It's what makes a fully released Vizard so far superior to a random holo. You don't just turn into one, you turn into one with overcharged abilities. She paused, then sighed in clear annoyance. Although all that mine gets is triplicating the explosion's power and making the recovery afterwards nearly instantaneous instead of slow as it otherwise be. Really, in terms of usefulness you couldn't come up with anything worse. Tatsuki wasn't sure that she wanted to continue discussing the drawbacks of Hiyori's monster in terms of its usefulness as a weapon, so she distracted her by redirecting the conversation. And what of the other ability? The one you can't use. That one has to do with Reishi control. Basically, you start with Sonido, but then, instead of breaching the shell covering you, you need to fold it around a portion of the condensed Ryotsu, so that when you breach it, the jet of Ryotsu fires it out like a projectile. It's very very fast, and since it's full of condensed Ryotsu, it explodes and does a lot of damage on impact. That one, you could use Hakuda on to give it a different effect, or fire it empty to trade off damage for even more speed. Even full, since it's fired at the speed of Sonido, it's still a faster attack than most people can even detect, let alone stop. Shinji called that one Bala. That sounds very useful. Hiyori nodded, and she could hear a certain fondness in her voice. Yeah, when he actually put in the effort, Shinji can be pretty lethal. He is a captain after all, you know. Then the fondness tinged itself with annoyance as she went on. But of course, he never used it to its full potential, because that'd be too violent. And while I tried to learn it, it's not that easy to teach. Manipulating Reishi is much harder than Ryotsu when it's loose. Having to control a portion that makes up your own body is really difficult. Hence why Shinji's the only one of us who can do it. She clapped her hands together, clearly intending to put an end to the discussion. And that's why you don't really need to worry about it right now, since you'd still need to learn Sonido first anyway. So, let's get you started on that, shall we? And so they did. As usual with Hiyori, Tatsuki found the experience tiring and was left an exhausted mess at the end, but she felt she had made real progress with it, and Hiyori tapped her on the shoulder afterwards with a grin of satisfaction. It was only once she was alone, and walking back home, that the voice of the monster in her mind, which had remained silent throughout the duration, spoke. It was deep and dark, echoing with power and cracking constantly, as if a burning fire was behind it. It was also, in Tatsuki's opinion, definitely a feminine voice, although why she felt so, she wouldn't have been able to say. You really think all this will give you any advantage in controlling me? Tatsuki didn't spoke out loud, she didn't need to after all, but did let her annoyance at the monster flare in the words she thought back at it. Well, Hiyori said so, didn't she? I think she know what she's talking about. Your reliance on that parasite is pathetic. Strong ones do not need others, they survive on their own. Tatsuki sent scorn at the holo at those words, making it clear how little she thought of them. Yeah, having people to rely on makes others so weak. That's how my friend cowed you. I didn't need to even lift a finger to have you shackled to me. If we are so weak, what does that makes you, I wonder? That just goes to prove you're as much of a parasite as your teacher, just more so, leeching not just off my strength, but even that of your so-called friends, those who are truly strong. Without them, what would your weakness have gotten you? Would you even be alive? Tatsuki's breath hitched for a moment at that, as the image of her burned body flashed through her head for a moment, but she pushed on past it and answered, with as much smugness as she could manage. Good thing I don't need to worry about that, and have people I know I can rely on. Truly, it is a good thing that you will never again need to rely on your own completely inexistent strength to survive, that your friends are strong enough to survive without your help. Can you think of what would happen if they ever actually needed to rely on you? What sad tragedy that would be, as you saw them be cut down without anything you could do to help. Tatsuki immediately clamped down on the fear that image conjured in her head, but the monster clearly noticed anyway as it continued, smug. That's why you're doing all this, isn't it? Because of fear. You fear that you won't be good enough, strong enough, and also, you fear me, and what I could do with your body once I take over. And you know I will, you know I'm strong enough to, that's what you fear the most. It's not. I'm not afraid of you. It took the monster's laughter for Tatsuki to realize that she'd shouted that out loud, and then the monster finished, sounding gleeful. I'm sure you aren't. Fear not, I will not take over you body, yet. And then, the voice quieted, and no matter how much she tried, Tatsuki couldn't reach it. She tried to settle herself, to persuade herself that she was not afraid, that she didn't see herself falling dead in the middle of a battle, or taken over by the monster, and her friends paying the price. She wasn't sure she succeeded. Such an interesting thing you have there. Urahara's smirk was particularly wide, and his eyes shone with excitement. Ichigo let out a long breath and asked, letting his tiredness show through. Can I lower my arm now? Oh, sure, I've seen enough of it. Ichigo let out a long breath, and lowered the arm where he'd been holding his Zanpakuto for Urahara to examine. So, you got anything out of it? Oh, definitely. As I said, it's really interesting. Urahara nodded happily, then turned toward his table, writing something down. Ichigo frowned, trying to avoid letting his annoyance show in his voice. And could you explain any of this interesting stuff to me? Urahara turned back at that, his grin a bit more mischievous. I could, probably, but I don't know that you'd understand everything. Mostly it is as you say, the connection is temporary and flaky, but serviceable. What's interesting is that such a connection is even possible in the first place. There's so many possibilities that opens up. Okay, but what I meant was if you could tell me what sort of training it would be best to start with to make the connection stronger. You said you can't pull power from it, nor can you access its shikai or even its sense to improve your own. Maybe you could try strengthening the blade? That only requires you to send your own Ryotsu to it, and it's one of the basics exercises anyway, so it should be easy. Ichigo's eyes widened as he understood what Urahara was talking about. It was the power that had allowed Hirako Shinji, and probably Rukia's brother as well, to make their sword cut straight through his. That's a basic exercise. Urahara chuckled and answered. The exercise is basic, mastering it is not. In fact, learning how to get the ability up to a level worthy of battlefield use is very difficult, so it's really not a combat technique. In fact, using it in battle before you've full control of it could get you killed. But as a training exercise it's very useful, and one of the first a Shinigami is taught. Ichigo glared at Urahara at that. And you didn't teach me any of this when I was training with Sode no Shirayuki, because... If anything, the scientist seemed even more amused at Ichigo's reaction to it. Because, as I just told you, it's not an ability that is any useful for actual combat. Plus, I suspect that the Ashwal wouldn't have really reacted to it, since it never was a real Zanpakuto. But since you're just trying to reinforce the connection right now, I think it's worth trying. And why is this thing not well suited for battle, anyway? Urahara just waved at him in a dismissive manner, his grin still in place. Just try it and I'm sure you'll figure it out for yourself. Ichigo nodded, then focused, gathering as much Ryotsu as he could, before sending it down the channel connecting him to his Zanpakuto. He felt it being taken and absorbed, the Zanpakuto growing stronger and sturdier as it ate more and more power, except he also felt it become much heavier and saw it grew longer and larger. He immediately stopped feeding Ryotsu to it, but even so the sword, which was now as long as Ichigo was tall and about 3 times as large as his arm, completely imbalanced him, slamming into the ground as he stumbled and was dragged down to him. He glared at Urahara's laughing figure once more, and then Shinigami explained, amused. See, when you send Ryotsu down a connection, the Zanpakuto automatically converts it into Reishi and adds it to itself, and naturally, adding stuff to it makes it larger and heavier and bigger. That's how eating works, after all. That doesn't help me at all, and doesn't really look like what Hirako was doing either. Ichigo stopped there, because he didn't want to let Urahara realize that he had managed to get the rise out of him he clearly wanted to, although from the Shinigami's grin, his efforts weren't very successful. Still, after a few more chuckles, the man turned a bit more serious as he clarified. The greater cutting power of empowered Zanpakuto comes from their density. Just feeding power to the blade is not enough, you need to also impose your will on the sword to keep it from growing, so that, instead of becoming huge and unwieldy, the sword instead compresses all that power into a tighter envelope for greater cutting power. Eventually, a Shinigami settles on a blade length that is good for them, with the right length and size, and even as they feed it more Ryotsu, they force the blade to maintain that specific size, so that instead of growing in size, the sword gains density instead. That made sense to Ichigo, but not entirely. A problem in the explanation seemed quite obvious. Even if they can keep the sword always of a fixed size, the weight would become a problem anyway, wouldn't it? The swords might no longer be unwieldy, but they'd still be far too heavy to actually fight with them. In fact, that much weight so concentrated would probably make it even harder to actually use them than the size would. Urahara nodded, apparently pleased with Ichigo's question. That's not a point most trainee Shinigami realize initially. I'm surprised that you got it so quickly. Ichigo looked incredulous, placing a hand on his hips as he watched Urahara. I might be new to spiritual combat, but I've been practicing kendo since I was 8, and teaching it for the last 2 years. I know what the difference between a proper sword and a badly weighted hunk of sword-shaped metal is like. The Shinigami raised his hands in surrender, which made Ichigo feel somewhat mocked, but before he could tell more, he continued in his explanation. Right, so you already know the why of the problem. As to the solution, it's just a matter of rearranging your balance, so that it's equally distributed across your whole body. Ichigo frowned. That doesn't make any sense. Because you're thinking of human weight. Kishi attraction works by the size of a mass, but Reishi attracts itself through emotions. Ichigo understood then. Adding mass to something did not necessarily add weight to it, but, as he eyed the huge sword he was sort of leaning onto, which was stuck to the ground, he realized that there was still some form of gravity going on here, just a different one. Thus, he looked at Urahara, who was beaming, clearly happy Ichigo was figuring out the problem on his own, and asked the obvious question. So, what sort of emotion is the ground projecting, and why do Shinigami even need Shunpo to stand on the air? In fact, I think Rukia even said that, in Soul Society, using Ho-Ho to do that doesn't really work. Urahara raised an eyebrow and said, in an expecting tone. Come on now, you should already be fully aware of which emotion it is that cause Reishi stuff to stick together. Affection. The whole world is giving off affection, isn't it? Precisely. That's why the whole spiritual world holds itself together, and acts as if it had a gravity for the soul that inhabit it, because the default emotion most Reishi in the spiritual realm is charged with is a soft level of affection for everything surrounding it. It was a reassuring idea, Ichigo had to admit. To think that the whole afterlife held itself together by bonds of affection, it was an hopeful feeling. Before he could reflect on that any further, however, Urahara continued, in a more lecturing tone. Thus, if you want to have the balance of an empowered sword work properly for you, you need to charge the Ryotsu you send to it beforehand, so that it's charged with just enough disgust to offset the basic sense of attraction that the ground would otherwise exert on it. You can obviously approximate it, but being able to know the exact balance of emotions you need to keep your sword fixed is one of the key aspects that separate an expert Zanjutsu user from a merely skilled one. Ichigo frowned. That sounded hard enough, but in his current situation, would it really be a good idea to send a flood of Ryotsu charged with disgust to a sword I don't even have a complete connection with? It could be misinterpreted, don't you think? Perhaps then you should discuss it with the sword itself. Explain what you're doing before you do. You're the one who spoke with the spirit within, do you think it would work? It probably would. Still, despite the fact that Ichigo was reasonably certain that, once he'd spoken with the Zanpakuto over the matter, the sword's spirit would be willing to work with him on this, Ichigo felt annoyed at having to go asking for the spirit's help so soon after he'd been told to prove himself worthy. It almost felt like giving up before the journey had even started. Even as he tried to think of how to best word his request to avoid giving that impression, he glanced down at the sword, and realizing something, he asked Urahara. So, when a trainee first makes this mistake I've made, how do they revert their sword to an usable state? Oh, that's simple, just draw back the Ryotsu you fed it, it should still be recognizable as yours. I've heard it said that if you keep feeding it without interruption, eventually the sword integrates it entirely and makes it a part of itself. But that's supposed to take years of continuous exposure. Really, picking out your own Ryotsu is the easiest thing in the world, just focus on it and reabsorb it. Ichigo stared at Urahara, which caused the man to frown. When nothing additional was forthcoming, Ichigo eventually said, trying really hard to hide his annoyance. Did you forget that I cannot reabsorb Ryotsu I've given through the connection I have? Urahara raised a finger and readied himself to say something, then stopped, mouth open, before eventually grimacing and scratching the back of his head with clear awkwardness. Ops. Ichigo grit his teeth, but Urahara was quick to speak again, his tone reassuring as he wildly waved his hands. Don't worry, the Ryotsu will leave the sword on its own if you don't feed it any more of it. It'll probably take a few hours, but my Shikai can reduce that to a few seconds. It's not a problem, really, just a little unforeseen happenstance. Those happen all the time when doing science, in fact, they're at the very heart of it. I'll take care of it right now. Ichigo was about to agree to that, but then stopped, as he considered that the Zanpakuto might not appreciate being the target of another Zanpakuto's Shikai without warning. However, even as he raised a hand to stop Urahara from using it, the suggestion sparked a different idea in him. He closed his hands around the hilt of the currently huge Zanpakuto, and then wrapped it in a coat of Ryotsu, ignoring the connection to instead surround the physical item itself with it, much as he'd done in the past when using the Oswal to fight Hirako. He carefully charged the external sides of the Ryotsu coat, the one not aimed at the blade, to project disgust outwards, and sure enough, the sword became far lighter, enough for Ichigo to easily lift it. It was still unwieldy, but that wasn't a big problem, since Urahara just said it would revert to its actual size soon enough. In fact, he realized with a grin, there was even a chance he might use this trick to help himself learn how to maintain the blade to a fixed size. Even if he lacked the control, he might just be able to use a determination or aloof envelope as an unyielding cast of sort to stop the sword's growth when he filled it with Ryotsu. How are you doing that? Ichigo turned to Urahara, who was watching him lift the huge blade with a certain fascination. He shrugged and explained, I'm just using Hakuta on the sword itself. I've done it against Hirako, and also when I was fighting the Minos. You have? That's not something I've ever seen anybody do before. And if you hadn't told me, I'm not sure I'd have been able to tell either. The Zanpakuto's own Ryotsu makes it hard to distinguish what's going on. Really? Hirako could notice it easily enough. Probably because the Oswal doesn't have the same radiance as Zanpakuto does. But that's not the point. The point is that it's something completely new to me. That's not something I get to experience very often. That left Ichigo surprised once again. Hirako had said that it was a clever trick when he'd seen him use it, but he'd been able to see it for what it was, and Ichigo had merely assumed it was something uncommon, not something that an expert of weird things like Urahara had never seen before. It's not that difficult to do. Why would somebody not have tried it before? Urahara seemed to consider the matter, then shrugged and answered. Probably a matter of simplicity and effectiveness, that would be my best guess. Empowering your Zanpakuto with Ryotsu through your connection would always be superior to anything your trick does, and controlling the weight is really not hard at all. You said it yourself, you'd just need to talk with your sword spirit to do it, and that would only take a few minutes. The blonde Shinigami cocked his head to the side, then added, sounding thoughtful. Plus, it's not really a trick, is it? More of a crutch than anything. You'll need to learn to do it the proper way eventually, as you'll never be able to fight at your full potential if you have to expend a portion of your Ryotsu and a good deal of your focus on keeping up what's essentially a pair of training wheels. It's sort of wasted time to train in something you'll eventually outgrow. Ichigo acknowledged that what Urahara was saying made perfect sense. Even so, if this really was something nobody ever did, maybe it was worth exploring? It would probably lead nowhere, but it's not like he was in a hurry to learn this. He was only doing this training in exchange for being kept abreast of Rukia's situation by Urahara. He might as well have fun while he was at it. And while low, the possibility it might lead to some new breakthrough into a field of martial arts he was pretty new at was exciting for somebody like him, who liked to analyze the working of martial arts enough to have gotten himself a job out teaching people how to do it. Do you mind if I practice with it a bit anyway? I know it won't really add much to your studies of the connection, but I'm really curious to see where it might lead. It's an interesting challenge. Urahara considered, then nodded. Sure, but you still need to devote at least 2/3 of your practice time to working on the sword connection, and also give me a report of any progress you make in this experiment of yours, in case anything interesting comes up. Does that sound fair to you? Yeah, I think I can work with that. That said, Ichigo focused on checking what his new trick could do. trying to see if varying the amount or type of emotion on the coating could be used to also compensate for the unwieldy size, in addition to the weight. The result of his first attempt had him stumbling into the ground, but he didn't let that bother him, instead getting up and ready to try again. He couldn't help but grin. He'd only ever been practicing the spiritual martial arts with a focus on defeating hollows and protecting others, but this was the first time he was doing it for himself. Soon enough, he lost himself in the practice, and as he did, he failed to notice as the emotions coming from the sword changed slightly as he practiced. The slow beat of the Zanpakuto eventually matching his own as weapon and wielder experienced the same emotion together. For Ichigo, right then, all he could notice was that he was having fun. Chapter 35, Mentors. You have been pushing yourself very hard lately, Urayu. It took a long breath before Urayu could acknowledge his master words with a respectful bow. His master nodded at that, and then seemed to consider in silence while Urayu waited with bated breath. I have to admit, however, that it is producing result. That was an excellent demonstration of great progress. Would you tell me what has you so motivated to improve? Urayu managed to remain properly impassive, but inside, he was very satisfied with the pride. He had done his best to outdo himself, it was true, but even so, there had still been the niggling doubt that he might fall short of his master's expectations. It was reassuring that he hadn't. Setting that apart, Urayu focused on his answer. If he wanted to get what he wanted out of the meeting, he needed to present things in a certain light to his master, and while he wouldn't be lying, exactly, just presenting certain truths in a more favorable light, it was still best to have his wits about him as he did. To lie to his master would be a horrible breach of trust, and he had very little confidence that he could be successful at it, and even what little misdirection he wanted to attempt was dangerous, but for his friends, he had to at least try. It is a result of the recent development in my investigation of the Shinigami through their agents. I find myself in a situation where superior mastery of my skills will be required for me to direct the investigation properly. The master's golden eyes studied Urayu with a piercing intensity, and he held the gaze as best he could, trying to hide his fear at having his real intentions discovered. They stayed there for a few moments, until Master Haiwan eventually nodded, allowing Urayu to break eye contact. It seems to me that you fear something, Urayu. Is that not so? Urayu's shoulders slumped slightly at that, as he acknowledged himself that trying to fool his master had been a ridiculous notion. He nodded, unsure how to explain himself, and then, before he could, Master Haiwan asked, sounding inquisitive. Was it the Minos Grande that scared you so? I must admit that the others were worried and wanted to come in your support when they sensed such a presence in our city right next to you, but I held them back, assuring them everything was well in hand, and you would request help if it was needed. Seeing as nothing was destroyed, it seems my trust of your judgment was well founded. There is no reason to feel shame at feeling fear in the face of such a force of nature, especially when you met it twice in the span of a single week. The sudden relief that flooded Urayu at that was mixed with genuine surprise. His master had correctly identified the existence of Urayu's fear, but, instead of understanding its source, he misunderstood it, and, Urayu realized suddenly, he would now believe Urayu's relief as being a result of being told there was no shame in having said fear. And suddenly, Urayu knew what was the best way to present what he wanted. He looked up at his master, determined to succeed and unafraid to let his master see it, only hiding the reason for the emotion instead, and said, "That is part of it, master, but it's not just me that I fear for. One of the other humans that have been involved with the Shinigami, I discovered, is a Quincy, although he hasn't been trained in the arts himself." His master's eyebrow furrowed at that, although it quickly passed as he demanded, in his usual polite but firm tone. "Why bring this to my attention, Urayu?" "Because I would request permission, master, that him being taught the Quincy arts, in the face of the danger he finds himself in, I find it remiss of us, that one of our brethren should be left without the protection they provide." His master expression turned stern at those words, and he said, in a very serious tone, "Urayu, while your preoccupation for the well-being of a fellow Quincy does you credit, if his family choose to deny him instruction, interfering would be seen as a serious overreach. You are aware of how much your father was angered by my taking over your teachings." Indeed, Urayu was. Ryukin Ishida was perennially disappointed in his son's choice not to relinquish the family's teachings, and while he had not forced him to stop, he had protested with Master Haiwan, and retracted all economical support that the Ishida, by far the richest Quincy family in Japan, had been providing him. That Master Haiwan continued to teach Uriah despite this was a testament to how close he'd been to Uriah's grandfather, and it was a debt of gratitude Uriah would never be able to repay. And why, even if it was for a good cause, even misleading his master sat wrong on Uriah. But he had thought long and deeply on his course of action before deciding this, and wouldn't let himself be so easily swayed. This really was the best option available, and he needed to see it through. More practically, he had a very valid answer to his master's objection, so he answered. His family did not deny him instruction, Master. His mother died before she could teach him, and his father is not a Quincy himself, from what I have gathered. It was rare for surprise to appear on Master Haiwan's face, so even if it was just for a barest of moments, Uriah didn't miss it. However, before he could make mention of it, not that he would have, his master had collected himself and went on, in the same tone. If what you say is true, then I expect that, to stand next to you and the Shinigami against the Minos, he is sufficiently competent in the inferior teachings. Things being so, I would not sully myself by teaching the arts to one who has forsaken them in favor of lesser means. It would be unbecoming. Personally, after having seen what Orium and Sato were capable of with their abilities, Uriah was re-evaluating the assumption that Fullbringer abilities were truly inferior and deserving of such scorn. Of course, the Quincy arts were superior in terms of practical utility, but a tricky or well-trained Fullbringer power could put even a skilled Quincy in a difficult situation, as the size-changing power Dakugane had used on him and Rukia proved. Still, telling his master that he was perhaps underestimating the power of Fullbringers would not be conducive at all to Uriah's goals, so he decided to ignore it, instead focusing on what he was here for. I understand that, Master, which is why I would ask permission to train the boy myself. There was a long pause at that, as his master processed Uriah's request. Technically, with his master having just acknowledged he had reached full mastery in Risotenge and Kirchen Lied, Uriah was knowledgeable enough to teach a pupil. In practice, if his master thought he wasn't ready to teach somebody, then he'd better listen, since teaching was harder and required far more knowledge and understanding in whatever was being taught than mere practical ability to use it. And, of course, taking a student without his master's permission would be considered a true insult, since it implied he thought he knew better than his master. Which was why Uriah was never going to tell his master that he'd already taught some basis of the Quincy arts to Kurosaki. He was still sure that it had been the right thing to do at the time, but if he had to teach him more of it, which seemed likely when he no longer had his borrowed Zanpakuto, it would be best to be authorized to do it. It'd make everything much smoother. Uriah's train of thought was broken as his master said, understanding in his voice. You mean for me to understand that you pushed yourself so much, perfecting your skills until I could acknowledge you as capable of teaching, just for this boy? What makes him so special? That was a difficult question, the answer to which Uriah wasn't completely sure of himself, but if he said that to his master, he would not receive the permission he needed. So he answered instead, keeping himself as collected as he could. I feel that there is great potential in him, and furthermore, it would strengthen his ties to us. Without our help to open his eyes, I fear he might let himself be made into a puppet of the Shinigami. In a sense, that was true. His willingness to teach Ichigo when he has started doubting them had solidified Ichigo's trust him over the Shinigami, although an honest answer would include the fact this was but a small piece of the situation. Still, it was the piece that mattered, and it wasn't a full lie his master could catch him into, so Uriah stuck to that, and luckily for him, after a very long pause to think the matter over, his master nodded. I can see that you will not be easily dissuaded, so I shall allow this. However, Uriah, I expect a report on anything you taught the boy, so that I can judge your abilities, and should I demand that you stop or adopt a different approach, you shall obey me. Is that clear? Of course, Master, I would gladly accept your suggestions and wisdom in this as in all matters. Master Haiwan nodded, but before he could be dismissed, Uriah quickly added, bowing again. If you would, Master, there is another request I would present to your consideration. His master raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, allowing Uriah to continue. Due to the current situation in the Soul Society, I expect the Shinigami I am working with might request some members of our group to head to Soul Society, to testify on the matter of our confrontation with the Minos Grande. If that were the case, I would ask you for permission to take such journey. You realize how dangerous it would be for you to do something like that? The Shinigami might choose to detain you in Soul Society once you were on their territory, and we would be unable to protect you in such an event. I understand the risks involved, but I feel like this could be a priceless opportunity to learn more about the internal political situation of the Soul Society, as well as give me a perfect cover to collect information about my other, more personal concern. If he could manage it, that was, but he wasn't going to tell his master that this was just a plan he'd improvised in order to help Rukia. While he respected his master very deeply, he knew the man would not be willing to entertain the idea that a Shinigami might be worth saving for the sake of who she was, since to him, they were all equally guilty as part of a corrupt system. Instead, putting it all on the other reason, that it might provide some clues to finally find out who had been behind his grandfather's death, was his best hope to persuade Master Haiwan to let him go. He could see that his master was conflicted, but eventually he closed his eyes, and nodded toward Urayu in acknowledgement. Very well, my student, I shall allow you to make this journey, should the opportunity for it present itself, but I will want a full report of your activities upon your return. Thank you, Master, I will make sure to. Very well, then you are free to go. Urayu bowed again, and was about to turn, before his master stopped him by raising a hand and asking. Before you go, however, tell me, what is the name of this student you are taking? I would know who it is who will be benefiting from my teachings, if only indirectly and through your person. Of course, he's named Ichigo Kurosaki. Once again, Urayu could see a flash of surprise, or perhaps recognition, in his master's eyes. Once again, it was gone before he could react to it, and when his master nodded for him to go, Urayu did, although he was left wondering. Was there a story behind his master's surprise? Urayu had gathered that Kurosaki's mother was dead and had been a Quincy from talking with Orium, but had never really asked, either himself or Kurosaki, if there was a reason why she had not been part of the clan in the first place. Kurosaki's father was a full-bringer, that much he'd seen for himself when the man was working, so it might be that she'd married against her family's wish, that might be the explanation. Urayu thought the matter over for a bit more, but once he reached the meeting place where he'd set Ichigo and Orium to meet him, he set it aside as he saw the two of them waiting, then frowning after getting close. Once he was close enough to stop, he gestured to the sword tied at Orium's side and the one Ichigo was carrying slung over his shoulder, letting his confusion show as he asked, "What's going on?" Orium smiled and waved her hands excitedly as she answered. "Ichigo and I have gotten orphan Zanpakuto, to help them feel less lonely. Won't that take decades?" Orium puffed her cheeks at that. "That's no reason not to do it, just a reason to start it as soon as possible." Urayu wasn't sure how to answer to that. Luckily, Kurosaki solved the issue for him by speaking up. "Actually, Urahara thinks I might be able to connect with my own much faster than that. It's sort of an experiment I'm trying for him. I think it might work." "That explains why you're carrying it." "It doesn't explain how you're doing it, that thing is humongous." Kurosaki smiled awkwardly at that. "Ah, that's my fault, I overcharged it. It should go back to a portable size in 10 minutes or so." Then he grinned, obviously pleased with himself, as he added. "And carrying it requires a trick that I think might prove useful. Honestly, I'm thinking of keeping it larger whenever I can, so I can practice it, but I'll need to speak with the sword first to make sure that's not a problem." Urayu couldn't help but feel a bit disgruntled at that as he commented, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Well, I suppose if you've got yourself a new Zanpakuto, then you won't need Quincy training anymore." Kurosaki looked surprised at that and answered, sounding confused. "Why not? It was useful in the last fight, I'm sure having some more practice wouldn't hurt." Urayu supposed that was true. If nothing else, it meant that the effort he'd gone through to get permission to teach Kurosaki the stuff would not end up being wasted time after all. Still, they had more important matters to deal with right now, so he pressed forward. "So, if he was willing to have you carry out this experiment for him, I guess you were able to settle matters with Urahara." "Yeah, although Yuaki wasn't there, so I don't know about her." "Still, that means he's agreed to keep us informed of what's going on with Rukia." When Kurosaki and Orium both nodded, Urayu went on, making sure they could hear how serious he was. Then I think we should ask them to let us testify on her behalf at her process. Both of them looked puzzled, but it was Kurosaki who spoke first. What need is there? They said she'll be left out after Aizen testifies himself in a couple of days. Maybe, but having extra support can't hurt, right? Besides, while it's good that Rukia shouldn't be in any real trouble, that won't help with solving the real problem of whatever's really going on with the Vizard, but if we present them with overwhelming evidence, that might force them to do something. Kurosaki didn't look convinced, but nodded in agreement anyway. I guess I can ask Urahara, but I wouldn't expect too much. Uriah didn't push the argument, happy with the agreement. It wasn't much, but it was better than doing nothing. Kurosaki might be willing to trust a Shinigami tribunal, but Uriah was not. To leave the fate of a friend in their hands did not sit well with him. He was a Quincy after all, and Quincy took care of their problems on their own. And sometime, he added to himself as he waved goodbye to the other two, with the help of friends. Momo Hinamori knew that, objectively, she was not a very good person. She always failed to take into account people's feelings, no matter how hard she tried, hurting them by accident, and she took far too much glee and satisfaction in proving herself smarter than other people, which was very arrogant. She tried to compensate for it by being as kind and forgiving as possible. Since she was fully aware that she was the first that should be asking for forgiveness from others, it only made sense to always be ready to return that which she was so generously given. Much as it was the right thing to do, it occasionally got tiring to interact with people that could so easily be hurt, which was why, even as she always left her door open for any who needed it and never refused any invitations to anything, she much preferred the company of her research data and informational sheets. Those, at least, she knew could not get hurt from her carelessness, and they didn't make it difficult to understand what they had to say, instead showing it clearly in numbers and lines. Which was why the task Rukia had given her had Momo feeling very happy. It was a way to help somebody who was treated her as a friend despite how undeserving of it she was, while carrying no possibility of hurting her feeling accidentally, and involving a great deal of comparing data from the multitude of printout sheets she'd found. Momo still had trouble believing that two spies from the 3rd and 12th Division had been working with criminals in the mortal realm to steal one of Captain Aizen's most dangerous research projects, but she knew Rukia wouldn't lie to her, so it had to be true. The hardest thing to believe was when Rukia had said that they couldn't be sure that Captain Jin wasn't the spy. Toshiro always spoke so well of him. Momo couldn't believe the man was a spy, even if he was really quite creepy and far less pleasant to be around than most people already were. It was really impossible to tell what, of the many possible things Momo could say, might hurt him, because he always kept that strange smile, and Momo always felt nervous in his presence. Even other people, who had no trouble reading each other, had that trouble with him, so Momo could understand why even Rukia, who somehow seemed to always know what people were really thinking, wasn't sure of him. Whether he was or not, however, was what Momo would find out soon, although Rukia did say it was more important to discover the spy in their own division, which was why Momo had just spent the last 4 days searching through the archives and collecting a number of printout of the communications and movements of every person within the division's headquarters. Most members of the division weren't even aware that every building was filled with sensors that monitored the movement of any Reishi and Ryotsu conglomerate throughout the area. It was all regularly approved, of course, since it was the best way to monitor experiments, but Captain Aizen had wanted to keep it secret from most. Something about how people might feel their privacy was threatened. Which Momo found silly. Members of the 12th were supposed to only be in the headquarters when working on an experiment or examining data, but Captain Aizen had explained that it was a psychological thing, and she had no doubt he knew what he was talking about. It had been one of the first projects she'd completed for Captain Aizen, and Momo was very proud of it. The idea that it might now help her find the spy was exhilarating. In the end, she frowned when she finally found something. While it was useful, it wasn't what she needed. Still, she consoled herself, it was better than nothing. The key, it turned out, had been the secret reverse backups she had included for fun, since one of the things about the system was that, while it sent the report normally, it also saved a number of backups for double-checking, in case of emergency or damage to the primary storage devices. She had been bored at the time, so she had decided on a whim to have one of the 3 backups be coded to be stored in reverse, just for fun, It was a thing that only a physical check of the documents would be able to reveal, since the machine that normally read them was a sophisticated creation the lieutenant before Lieutenant Kuratsuki, and it had an autocorrect function that automatically straightened reverse documents upon reading. She was probably the only one to know it, and she had never found it important enough to include in her report at the end of the project, since it was somewhat embarrassing to admit she'd messed with a project like this for no real reason. If not for that, Momo would never have realized anything was amiss, but when she checked the reverse backups, she realized that a number of them matched the base readout instead of being reversed, which meant somebody had tampered with the equipment, and then removed the traces of the tampering, and replaced them with fake ones. Momo doubted that even Captain Eisen could have realized it. The fact that the backup were coded in reverse was not meant as a security detail, and everything else about the tampered records was perfect. This, Momo knew, proved without a doubt that Rukia and Captain Eisen were right about there being a spy, and in fact it really restricted the suspects. Only seated officers had the required clearance to do this kind of modifications, and she was pretty sure some of the new ones didn't even knew about the sensor system, so this meant they'd reduced the number of possible culprits to less than 10 people. Momo grinned. This was great news. She made sure to make an extra copy of everything she'd found, to bring to Captain Eisen, before returning everything else to its place. Then she paused, and made a second that she slid into the folder she was going to pass Kira, so he could look into finding whoever the spy in the 3rd Division was. At the thought, she frowned a bit. She would have preferred to tell Toshiro as well, but Rukia had been very insistent that, until they could prove Captain Jin wasn't involved, they needed to keep Toshiro out of the loop. She'd said that forcing him to keep such a secret from Captain Jin would hurt him, and Momo trusted Rukia to know better about this, but she didn't really like the idea at all. She was sure Toshiro would be very hurt by them not telling him, even if it was to avoid hurting him more. Momo thought about it for a bit, and then decided she would bake him a pie. An apology cake with a lot of his favorite ice cream filling, in fact. She was still considering whether it'd be better to have the frosting be blue or white. Baking really was just as relaxing as doing research, since ingredients too clearly told you how you had to treat them by their smell and taste, when she realized her feet had led her to the office of Captain Eisen. Which was where she wanted to go, but even so, this was huge. One of the people she worked with every day might be a spy, somebody she thought she could trust had betrayed her. It was a very hurtful though, but, Momo reasoned as she knocked on the door of his office, Captain Eisen would know what to do about it. She could trust him, at least, and that was the most important thing. Come in. When Captain Eisen raised his head from the documents he was checking, he smiled in that kind manner of his upon seeing Momo, which caused her to smile back as well. He gestured for her to take a seat as he put his work aside to focus on her. Momo. What leads you here? It's about Rukia, Captain. I think I can help now. That caused the captain to frown and ask, in clear concern. Is anything wrong with Rukia? I thought you'd been visiting her these last few days. I have, every day, but she also explained to me why she's imprisoned. Then, realizing how that might sound, she hurried to add, waving her hands. Not everything. She's kept the secrets you asked her to, Captain, but she did told me about the spy in our division, and I think I might have found proof it exists, and that it's one of our seated officers. The captain had looked confused at first, but then his eyes widened in surprise at the end. You did? That's remarkably impressive, Momo. He paused, then added with a smile. But, of course, only to be expected of somebody as smart as you. Would you explain to me how you managed such a feat? Momo quickly placed her copies on the desk and was quick to explain how she'd managed to do it. The captain followed attentively as he always did, and in the end smiled, ruffling her hairs a bit, something which made her feel special, since she'd never seen him do it to anybody else. I truly had no idea such a thing was even possible, Momo. You really managed to surprise me, and that's rare. A job well done, for sure. Thank you, Captain. She basked in the praise for a moment, but then remembered why she'd done this all and quickly asked, a bit of worry returning to her tone. So, you think this will help with keeping Rukia safe? I would expect so. I shall be taking this copy with me as I go to the deposition, so I can present it if there are any doubts about my honesty. Momo let out a long breath of relief. her heart beating a bit slower and calmer. It was good to know she'd done her part to help her friend. Then she wondered, as she handed the copy to the captain. "Do you know when that is gonna be, Captain?" "Yes, they summoned me for tonight. I will be leaving in a few more hours." "Oh. Then I shouldn't be taking up your time. You'll need to prepare, and you have so much work left too." She was about to excuse herself, but the captain smiled gently, placing a hand on her arm as he said, in a reassuring tone, "Don't worry, Momo, I've been ready for this meeting for a while now, and a few documents aren't more important than you are. In fact, your work was good enough, you should feel proud of yourself, and relax a bit." Momo hesitated, but then the captain seemed to remember something and reached for a drawer in his desk, pulling out what looked like a small box full of strange chocolate cubes with some artistic color on them. He placed the box on the table and offered it to her as he explained. "I just got these as a gift for your birthday, but I think what you just did should deserve some reward. You still enjoy trying out new sweets, don't you?" Momo did, and so she was quick to eat her fill, although only after offering to share with the captain, who, being his usual polite self, only took one and let her the rest. As they were eating, she quickly and him slowly as was the norm for them, the captain paused to ask, thoughtfully, "Momo, you trust me deeply, don't you?" "Of course, Captain Aizen." "You don't doubt me, do you?" He smiled indulgently, obviously seeing the worry on her face easily, and soothed her with a smile and assuming a more reassuring tone. "No, Momo, I know how much I can trust you, don't worry. But I wanted to ask you why you believe in me so much." Momo was left confused by that, unsure how to answer, but when he smiled encouragingly as he waited, she decided to try her best to explain why she admired him so much. It's because of how kind you are, Captain. You always seems to know when everybody is feeling down and how to help them feel better. You're always so polite and friendly, and, even when you have to scold somebody, you always manage to do it in a way that builds people up, rather than tearing them down. I find that so admirable. It's what I'd like myself to be like." Momo could feel her throat going raw a bit from the passion she'd spoken with, so she stopped herself with a small cough. Still, she felt happy for having said it all like that. She believed it all fully, and to be able to put it into words had been liberating, in a way. She couldn't help but smile at her captain as she considered how uniquely good he was, although Captain Aizen himself seemed a bit surprised as he thought over what she'd said. Eventually, he said, with the same curious tone, "I have to admit I never considered things from that point of view. But surely you know, Momo, that I am not always in agreement with everybody. In fact, I've often spoken against the politics of our very society. Surely that is a way in which I am not as fully kind as you describe me." Momo shook her head quickly at that. She hadn't expected the captain to misunderstand her, he usually never did. Surely she'd just explained herself wrongly, so she clarified her thoughts. "Of course you don't agree with everybody, but even when you disagree, you only do it in the kindest manner, don't you, Captain? Even when you criticized people, you did following the right channels, and you'd always want things to be solved peacefully. Even the critics you present are to improve people's living conditions. That's just another things that prove why you're so kind, because even when you disagree, you'd never force other to see things as you do, in any way. That's why I admire you so much. So it is this kindness you see in me, that makes you so loyal." "Of course." She nodded with as much emphasis as she could, and Captain Aizen's thoughtful expression switched to a soft smile as he ruffled her hairs once more, before pausing and fixing them back to the bob she preferred to keep them into. Momo couldn't help but giggle a bit at that. Even when being affectionate, her captain still managed to take everybody's emotions into account and treat them rightly. Then he said, with a smile, "Thank you for your words, Momo. Were you going anywhere, or do you want to stay a bit more?" Momo's eyes widened as she realized she might miss her meeting with Kira if she stayed any longer, so she quickly bowed and apologized to the captain for having to go, for which he, in his typical fashion, forgave her immediately, and then quickly left. Still, the small conversation led her in a very upbeat mood, knowing that she could count on Captain Aizen and even confide everything she thought of him honestly, and for him to have accepted it so easily, even as she always had known he would have, made her world feel a bit more solid. And soon, Rukia would be free, and the world would be back to being perfect once again. His sword spirit looked thoughtful at Ichigo's explanation of his training plans, leaning on the long metal flagpole where he'd first appeared to him. Ichigo gave the man the time he needed to truly consider his explanation. While he waited for his answer, he just hoped it would be positive, since if he wanted to persuade Urahara to go along with Ishida's plan, he really needed to show the Shinigami scientist some progress. Eventually, when the Zanpakuto spirit spoke, his words were laced with clear doubt. "I was not aware that such a thing was even possible." Ichigo shrugged, unsure how to answer that. "Neither was I, until Urahara explained it to me, but it seems like something worth trying." "And you say that you need to send Ryotsu charged with repulsion to me for the ability to work." "That's what Urahara said, although it's only the first step. I also need to learn how to contain the Ryotsu so your blade will not change size, although I still can see uses for the larger size, honestly." The sword spirit nodded, then said, sounding curious. "Did Urahara give you any idea what would happen if you sent Ryotsu charged in a different manner? For example, you mentioned yourself that you used this coding ability with your previous Zanpakuto to make its edge flame-like. If you sent to me Ryotsu charged with anger directly, would that change my very nature from steel to fire?" Ichigo was left surprised by the suggestion. It seemed a very simple idea, but it hadn't occurred to him to try out something like that. "I've no idea." The Zanpakuto spirit nodded, and then extended a hand to Ichigo, saying in a determined tone, "All right then, let's try. I'm curious as to what the results would be." Ichigo blinked. He'd not expected this to be hard, but he didn't think it would be this easy. Just like that. The dark-haired man didn't seem bothered. "Yes, but not outside, we'll do it here, right now." "Will that even tell us anything? If you're in spirit form rather than sword form, wouldn't your body react differently?" That caused the man to frown, and for a moment, Ichigo could feel that the Zanpakuto spirit had been offended. However, after a moment, he let out a long breath, seeming to calm down, although his voice still sounded quite annoyed. "How I look has no bearing on what I am. I appear here in a shape that makes it easier for us to interact, but that does not changes my nature. That I look like a man does not changes that I am, in fact, a sword. That you think I would be anything but just show your ignorance in interacting with a Zanpakuto." He took a step away from the flagpole, then struck it with a soft elbow strike. Ichigo felt a strange sense of vertigo at the hit, and when the spirit pointed at the point of impact, Ichigo realized that the flagpole had been damaged, but rather than a bump, it was a small cut, as if it'd been smacked into by a blade. Ichigo's eyes moved to the old man, who didn't relent from his serious expression as he explained. "What you see in your mindscape is not the reality of things, obviously. It is a simplified version of your perception that your mind created to make it easier for you to interact with it. How did you ever develop a mindscape in the first place, if you don't even know how they work?" That was a weird question, and Ichigo crossed his arms at being treated like a child in this manner. "How would I know? The first time I reached for a way to commune with my Zanpakuto, I found myself here. Maybe if you explained to me what it is I don't know, rather than getting angry because I am still new at this whole thing, it'd be better." Ichigo's words seemed to prompt the man to close his eyes with a sigh, massaging his temple as he did so. "I should have guessed." "What?" "That you didn't create your mindscape. Your last Zanpakuto created it for you, so you could have a place to interact into." That didn't sound right. "Are you sure about that?" "The first time we met, she didn't want to interact with me at all, and asked me to leave the moment she saw me. Why would somebody that wants no contact with me go to the length of creating a place for us to interact into? You really can't think of any reason why she might have wanted you to have a visual reminder of what her situation in being forced to give your power to another would be like." That made a startling amount of sense, actually. Had Sode no Shirayuki really created his mindscape for him, just so he could see with his own eyes that she was enslaved by the connection, and be moved by it? It seemed somewhat manipulative, but when thinking it over, Ichigo couldn't feel any animosity over it, if it was truly so. He had needed to see what her condition was for himself before he could understand how she felt, and if he'd never understood, they'd never have managed to work together as well as they had. Not to mention how guilty he would have felt, if he'd realized that he had been stealing her power and torturing her for it on his own at a later point. No, he decided, nodding to himself, he didn't resent it, manipulation or not, what Sode no Shirayuki had done had been the right thing for them both. That still left him a bit perplexed over how the whole thing worked, however. Say that you're right, does that means that, now that I know, I could change how everything looks here? Make it a nice sunny meadow, or something? The Zanpakuto spirit scoffed. Of course not, that'd be silly. A mindscape is a very advanced meditation technique that allows you to manifest your thoughts in metaphorical form, so that you can explore and examine them in a manner your mind is better suited to interpreting. It's a teaching aid and a mean of self-reflection. Everything you see is a manifestation of how you feel about things, the way you approach them, how you think. Learn to decipher the metaphor, and you'll know more about yourself. Sometimes, that might lead to eventually changing the way in which you see and interact with the world, and if you change yourself deeply enough, then the changes will reflect themselves in your mindscape. Like, Ichigo realized wryly, the weather changing from snowy to rainy, as a memory of something that once was there but now was absent, yet still missed. The Zanpakuto didn't seem to realize Ichigo had had a revelation over the matter, however, as he continued his explanation in a very lecturing tone. But even such a process is extremely gradual, and you'd probably be hard-pressed to notice any changes that weren't very wide, and generally the result of sweeping, huge change in your life. If somebody existed who was able to change their own mindscape at will, I would never want to meet such a person. Anyone capable of that level of willing self-deception would not be pleasant company. I guess that makes sense. Thanks for the explanation, I guess I really did need it. His interlocutor nodded in a condescending manner, but considering the situation, Ichigo was inclined to let it slide. He should have questioned the situation more when he was first brought into it, and regardless, he was thankful of having received the explanation now. Still, useful as the knowledge was, Ichigo wasn't sure he saw what utility it served right now. So your look is just appearance and not fight, but I don't see how that'll help with this experiment you want to make. It will be easier to show you, for now, just send your disdain throughout the channel, so that I can get a sense for what that's like. And once more, the old man extended his hands to Ichigo. This time, he clasped it, and as he did, now that he was paying attention, he could feel the connection the Zanpakuto had offered him becoming more open to his Ryutsu, so obediently he sent a certain influx of it into it. The moment he was done, the Zanpakuto spirit seemed to change in front of Ichigo. He still looked the same, but he was now taller and larger than before. Then, the old man let go of Ichigo's hands, and took a step backwards, except, to Ichigo's eyes, the old man's feet seemed to blur, his movements so fast he couldn't rightly track them. After a moment, the spirit nodded to himself, apparently pleased with the result, and then turned back to offer his hand to Ichigo again. Now, try for rage. A smaller amount than you sent before, but try to make it the hottest rage you can manage. That is an emotion where quality is much more important than quantity. Ichigo nodded, then closed his eyes, trying to find a source of enough rage. Almost immediately, the image of Rukia's bastard of a brother came to mind. The disdainful way in which he'd looked down on him, the arrogance with which he'd commanded Rukia as if she was not her own person but rather a thing which he owned. The fury rose almost unbidden, and it was so strong it took Ichigo a moment to remember that he was supposed to send it down the connection to his sword. Once he did, he felt almost empty, but also, surprisingly relaxed. With all of the anger removed from his soul, thinking was easier, and he could sense his own emotions much more clearly. He hadn't realized how much the anger he'd been keeping a lid on had been influencing him, but now that he wasn't holding on to it anymore, it really seemed like emotions that had been pushed away and crushed together to make space of it were more able to return to their proper place, filling the whole anger had left in him with peace and tranquility. It was not something he'd ever experienced before, but now that he had, he would not easily forget the feeling, he was sure of it. Quite the remarkably powerful rage you had there. Ichigo opened his eyes. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, but for the old man to have steam rising from all over his body had not been it. His every movement seemed to make more of it, and when Ichigo glanced at where his feet were staying, he saw that the gravel on the rooftop was slowly melting from heat he was generating. Yes, he didn't look like he was made of fire or anything like that. If not for the steam, Ichigo wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. The old man didn't actually smile, but there was a glint in his eyes that seemed pleased, as he said to Ichigo, It seems like you were correct, kid, this really does look like it might have some potential. I will let you train in this manner, but I request that you experiment with many different emotions, and also, that you occasionally try to combine them. I have a certain interest in seeing what the results of such might end up being. Thank you, I will be sure to do so. What of my other idea, however? About the shrouds. In truth, while Ichigo was glad he could now use the most normal method of reducing his sword's weight and thus, in theory, no longer needed to wrap the sword in a shroud of Hakuta-charged Ryotsu to make it work, he still wanted to experiment with that ability. He was sure there was potential to it, if only he could devote some time to train that. However, his Zanpakuto spirit just said that he wanted Ichigo to experiment on this other one. He'd hoped to alternate between training one and training the other, but he couldn't do that if it would jeopardize the agreement he'd just reached with the Zanpakuto. He hoped the old man would agree to at least let him spend a third of his training time on the shroud, and he readied himself to argue for that, so he was left completely dumbfounded when the sword spirit replied, in a very serious tone. Just train in both at once. Is there any reason you wouldn't be able to do so? I don't know. It might take too much concentration. Then it seems to me that you'll be training 3 things at once. If your concentration is that poor, you certainly need the practice. Ichigo didn't know what to answer to that. It made sense, in a training from hell sort of way, but then, he had to prove himself worthy of his power to this Zanpakuto, didn't he? If that meant he'd be left with a splitting headache at the end of each training session, he decided, it was a price worth paying. Seemingly satisfied that their conversation was over, the Zanpakuto turned to leave, but Ichigo couldn't help a sense of sudden curiosity. While he had not expected it to be too hard to get the Zanpakuto's help, he hadn't expected it to be this easy either. So, moved by curiosity and a desire to understand the old man more than anything else, he called back to him. Why are you so willing to let me experiment on this? You made no demands, gave me no tests, you just said me to go for it. The spirit raised an eyebrow. Would you have preferred it if I'd not helped you, or come up with some complicated test before I agreed to it? No, but I guess I just want to understand your motivations. Is that arrogant of me? The old man regarded him impassively for a long while, and Ichigo was starting to think that he might have pushed too far. However, the Zanpakuto eventually answered, in a serious tone. You have curiosity, and a desire to explore that which you don't know, at least when it comes to learning how to fight and how to properly wield a Zanpakuto. I can appreciate the value of that, and would not keep anyone from it. That is the reason why. Ichigo wasn't sure that he understood, but he shrugged. Even as he left his mindscape to return to reality, there was plenty of training in front of him, and now it was more than just himself that he did not want to disappoint with it. Rukia had always had a light sleep, so when somebody entered the corridor where her cell was, she woke up almost immediately, even though, with how sleepy she still felt, it took her a bit to realize that, while the person wasn't Momo nor Captain Aizen, she still recognized it, and was in a sense surprised it had took this long for him to show up. She was left a bit grumpy at being woken up early. She was pretty certain that dawn was still a few hours away, even if she didn't have any natural lighting to help her keep track of time, but most of all, she was relieved. In truth, she'd not expected him to show up, but now that he had, she realized she'd been waiting for it the whole time. Rukia. This took me longer than it should have, and you have my apologies for that. It's fine, really. He raised his hand, interrupting her, but gently, as his voice softly said. No, it's really not. I had to wait for permission, but having to put bureaucracy before the well-being of one of my charges is something I only acquiesced to because to do otherwise might jeopardize your case. Rukia shook her head, taking advantage of the motion to clean her eyes from any remaining sleep, and any random moisture that might have just found its way there by accident, and answered, her voice soft in gratitude. I understand, Captain Yukatake, truly. The man lowered his head slightly in a gesture of acceptance, a few locks of his white hairs escaping from the bangs he kept parted to the left, something of an unavoidable occurrence when the majority said hairs were long enough to reach his waist. He returned the rebellious hairs to their place in a gesture that Rukia knew as a staple of his mannerism, and then, unlike Captain Aizen but very much like Momo, he sat down in front of her cell, uncaring for how this would affect the white haori he was wearing. It was typical of the informal manner Jushiro Yukitake preferred to act, and Rukia's smile grew a bit larger at that. The captain meanwhile smiled as well, but it was a grateful smile, which gave a slight glint to his green eyes and made his emaciated face look more alive. "And I am so very glad you're such a understanding girl, Rukia. You always thought too high of me, Captain." The answer was almost instinctive, out of Rukia's lips before she'd had the time to even process it. It was nothing like herself, and Rukia blamed it on falling back into playing to her brother's expectations, rather than being herself. The sadness in her captain's eyes at the self-denigrating answer was almost a physical blow to Rukia, at least until Captain Yukitake spoke up in a reassuring voice. "Maybe so, but I would rather believe that you have thought of yourself too lowly for far too long." Rukia lowered her head, letting out a long breath as she answered. "I know. It was just easier that way." She then raised her head, straightening as she recalled all that she'd gone through in the last few months, and tried to make it clear to Captain Yukitake that she was being honest as she said, as determinedly as she could. "But I got better about that. I do take pride in what I can do right now, Captain." That caused the sadness to vanish from Captain Yukitake's eyes, replaced with pride, something he seemed to find so easy to have for her, which Rukia had never been sure how to react to. "I'm glad to hear it. You have earned it many times over." He then smiled in that kindly manner of his as he added, sounding curious. "I suppose that means I should apologize to Captain Aizen. I was not certain that he would be able to give you the help you needed, given how prone to humility he himself is, but if what you say is true, then I clearly misjudged his ability to be of help to you." Rukia was left stumped at that, because while in a sense Captain Yukitake was wrong, in the other he was very much right. Captain Aizen was indeed much too humble and had not encouraged her to be more assertive, so Captain Yukitake's understanding of him had not been wrong. However, being able to spend more time day to day with somebody like Momo, who always celebrated her victories, and more importantly, her mission under the tutelage of Urahara and Yoriyuki, neither of whom had any shred of humility left in their soul, which were the things that had given her back her self-confidence, would not have been possible without Captain Aizen accepting her in his division and giving her his trust. And Rukia wasn't quite sure how to explain this to Captain Yukitake, especially when a part of it would have required revealing that she'd spent her entire last mission working alongside what the Godi 13 considered traitors. Which she had no intention of doing. It left her a bit floundering for an answer, so she settled on the more neutral one she could think of. "It's more that he put me in a situation where I could get better, rather than being directly responsible for it himself. That was still a good call on his part, I would say. This would be the mission you were sent on, I presume? Which you are now going to tell me you are not allowed to reveal any particulars about." In retrospect, it had been silly to expect to fool Captain Yukitake about that. He knew her much too well, and while she was grateful that he looked out for her, it could sometime become a problem when she didn't wanted to put all of her emotional turmoil on display. And indeed, Captain Yukitake saw her conflicted feelings on how best to answer honestly to one of the people she genuinely respected without betraying one of the other ones, as he reached forward and took one of her hands in hers, saying in a soft tone, "Rukia, it's fine. I understand that you can't talk of the events themselves. But can you at least talk to me about your feelings over them? You have been caged by the people that should keep you safe because of your loyalty to somebody who did much for you, and I don't doubt also because you believe it was the right thing to do. That can't be easy on you. You don't need to reveal any secrets to be honest about how you're feeling." Then he let go of her hand and continued, with a self-deprecating smile. "And you don't need to talk about your feeling either, if you don't want to. They are yours to keep, not mine to intrude upon. We can just chat of something else if you would prefer that. I don't want to force you into anything. I just hoped you might appreciated the listening here of an old man to lend you a hand with any trouble you might be having." That got a smile out of her, while she knew that, technically speaking, Captain Yukitake would probably be at least as good as her brother at masking his own emotions and only letting out those he wanted to. For some reason she never could believe he did so. He just was so open, and let himself willingly so easy to read, with the small handful of exceptions that concerned his health, that she never doubted that the emotions she was perceiving from him were the real thing. Which was why the feeling of openness, understanding, and the genuine honesty of him being willing to let her decide on her own when it was the right time to open up about how she was feeling made her so happy. So she smirked a bit, and if it wasn't up to her usual standard, Captain Yucatec didn't comment on it and, if anything, seemed pleased by the effort regardless, and answered, trying to reach for a smugness she wasn't fully feeling right now. What trouble? I am actually fully comfortable and exactly where I mean to be. He raised an eyebrow in polite disbelief, even as his amusement showed loud and clear in the reflection of his soul. Really? You planned to be put in prison? Naturally, you have no idea how comfortable this cell really is. She held her smirk for a moment longer, and then both of them chuckled at the bit. As she did, she could feel a knot of tension loosening in her emotions, and then she said, in a more relaxed tone. I'd actually like to talk Kido for a bit, Captain, if that's fine with you. He nodded friendly, and so talk of Kido they did. It was refreshing in more ways than one. Not only had she missed being able to discuss Kido in detail during her mission, but as usual, discussing Kido with Captain Yucatec was a completely different experience from speaking about it with anybody else. While she enjoyed her discussions with Captain Aizen, spent swapping ideas, analyzing the tiniest details and speculating on possibilities, with Captain Yucatec she felt like she was actually learning new things every time, his insight always seeming to come from a level of greater knowledge than her own. While she valued both, there was something reassuring in this certainty that she was the pupil and he the teacher, rather than an equal colleague. Which, she knew, wasn't very fair to Captain Aizen. While he was incredibly skilled, and in fact, the fifth captain in terms of service length, with well over a millennia in the role, Captain Yucatec was one of the 4 who had been there longer, with nearly 3. And while Captain Anohana's service was longer still, given that she was one of the only 2 survivors of the original 13 founding captains, she had become a Kido Grandmaster only much later in her career. For the longest time, Captain Yucatec had been the only Kido Grandmaster in the entire Godi 13. And that was without taking into account the fact, which Rukia was one of the very few to know, that Captain Yucatec's skill in Kido was tested every day, as it was the only thing keeping him alive. While most high-ranked Shinigami knew that Captain Yucatec had a chronic health condition that could often leave him bedridden, almost nobody knew what it was, or how he'd come to have it. Rukia, however, had been told, when she'd proved herself skilled enough that Captain Yucatec had wanted to make her check the web of spells that kept his ailment at bay, she still couldn't believe that Captain Yucatec had considered her skills and personality worthy of such trust. The fact that she'd personally come up with 2 new ones, more advanced than any he'd been using before, both greatly reducing his pain and making him recover some of his lost mobility, was what she considered the greatest achievement of her career, and the ultimate proof that her pursuit of Kido was not, as other Shinigami had often told her, a distraction from more martial training. Rukia knew that her work saved lives. Despite this fact, that 2 of the spells keeping Captain Yucatec alive were of her own creation, and most of the others had come from Captain Anohana, the spell at the core of the web was what Rukia always came back to when considering Captain Yucatec's skill. He'd explained her, and Captain Anohana had confirmed it to be true, that he'd received the wound when an army of nearly 2,000 hollows led by 4 Vastolords had assaulted the Suriadii directly, in order to exterminate the recently formed Godi 13 to stop it from hunting down hollows. It was remembered as the most brutal and bloody battle in the history of Soul Society, with 7 of the original 13 captains losing their life during it, and nearly 2/3 of the Godi 13 forces at the time being exterminated. It was the closest Soul Society had come to destruction than it ever had before or since, with their victory marking the start of Soul Society's ascendance and the decline of the brutal rule by Hollow that had plagued the mortal and spiritual realm both in previous eras. Captain Yucatec had been one of the keys of that victory, as he had been the one to finish off one of the 4 enemy leaders, a Hollow with the power to cause instant necrosis in any soul and cause it to spread like a plague, an ability powerful in a manner only Vastolords could be. It was a power that had Rukia shivering whenever she thought of it, yet Captain Yucatec had managed to seal it inside himself, using it to destroy his enemy, and somehow survive the process. But the seal had not been perfect, and even with how many spells he had added, both immediately and throughout the centuries, it had kept slowly destroying him from the inside out. A constant torture that he could never fully escape, and which left Captain Yucatec's body almost hollowed, with barely enough reishi to form a human exterior and the handful of organs inside held together by a web of keto weaved amidst a sea of corrupted ryotsu. It was terrible, and something Rukia would not wish on an enemy, let alone somebody she respected. Nevertheless, unrelenting as the long-deceased Vastolord's power still was, it had been and still was contained, and despite having personally studied the Keto spell holding it at bay, Rukia still couldn't say that she fully understood it. She certainly couldn't replicate it. A spell that Captain Yucatake had come up with in the middle of a life-or-death battle on the fly was still better than any Rukia, Captain Anohana, or Captain Aizen had come up with over their whole lives. It was a testament to Captain Yucatake's skills, and whenever Rukia had the chance to really talk shop with him one-on-one, she truly felt like she was been given access to a well of bottomless knowledge. It was humbling and exhilarating at the same time, and in a sense, one of the things she missed most from being in the 13th Division. While the weekly group discussions with the seated officers of the Keto Corps always felt like she had to help them notice obvious thing, the chance to truly discuss her most favorite subject matter with the greatest master of it all had always been one of the highlights of her days. It was with these thoughts that, after what felt like a few minutes but she knew had to be at least 3 hours of relentless discussion, Rukia admitted, in a whisper that was still loud enough for Captain Yucatake to catch it perfectly. "The Keto Corps really is where I belong, isn't it?" There was no mistaking the affection and pride in her captain's voice as he answered. "And you're welcome to come back to it whenever you want, Rukia. There will always be a spot in the 13th Division for you." She shook her head, her fond smile turning set on her lips. She couldn't. "If I come back, you would make me lieutenant. It is the place you deserve. I believe it wholeheartedly that only you are fit to take it." Everybody in Seoul society knew that perfectly well. It was no secret, and in fact, it was a scandal. In a move that defied all tradition and regulations, Captain Yucatake had not named a new lieutenant after Kyan died and she transferred, keeping the place empty. Rukia had checked, and never in the history of Seoul society had an officer position being left open like that for more than 1 week. In fact, the Central 46 had even tried to punish him for it, but apparently some clans, and Rukia had little doubt over the name of one of those, were running interference. Which changed little the fact that Rukia didn't want the post. She knew what it would lead to, and she didn't want that responsibility on her shoulders. And, it was probably time to explain it to Captain Yucatake, instead of running away from it. With a long breath, Rukia steeled herself, straightening and looking him in the eye so he could be sure that she meant it. "Captain, after what happened with Kyan, I just can't stand the idea of having that responsibility. It would be too hard, knowing how much a single mistake on my part would cost." There was clear sympathy in the captain's eye at that comment, and he leaned forward, waiting for Rukia's nod of assent before placing a hand over her shoulder, gently squeezing it in a reassuring manner. "Rukia, I understand that. Nobody in their right mind would ever want that kind of responsibility. But somebody has to do it, and should it not be the best person for the job? You know that you are a good leader." He gave her shoulder another squeeze before letting go, and Rukia took a moment to collect herself before answering. "I'm not. I can come up with good plans, I won't deny that, but anybody can do that. A true leader needs to be like you, or Captain Aizen, or Kyan, somebody with the ability to inspire others, to reassure them when they have doubts, and who can make the split-second decisions that save life. That's not me." Captain Yucatake smiled, and once again, he looked proud. Rukia was confused as to why for a moment, since she was just refusing his offer once again, but he didn't let her wondering for long, instead proceeding to explain himself. "The last time we spoke of this, you would not have recognized that you have a natural talent for coming up with good plans. I'm glad you realize it now, and so I would ask, is that the result of something that happened on your secret mission?" Rukia smiled as she remembered her friends from the mortal realm, Ichigo and Uryu, Orium and Tatsuki and even Chad, people who trusted her to be smart and come up with a good plan, and who she could trust to be inspiring or make the right decisions in the heart of the moment. She nodded decisively, and while she knew her happiness at having met and befriended them was shining through, she didn't feel like hiding it. No, she didn't want to hide it. She was proud of the work they did together, and wasn't about to let that be taken away from her due to fear, nor was it something she'd let be embarrassed for. Yeah, it did. The mission was a success, and it was because of my plans. I know what my role is now, Captain. I'm not afraid to be part of a team anymore, but I'm not capable of leading. Captain Yucatec looked at her thoughtfully, then said, I understand your position, Rukia, even if I do not agree. Still, you are looking stronger. It's strange to think that you seem more sure of yourself behind bars than I ever saw you since you left the division, but I am glad for it nonetheless. That's because I wasn't joking, being here is really by my choice. I can't feel bad if I'm doing what I believe to be right, can I? I suppose not. It's just surprising, that's all. I am sure that you are loyal to Aizen and are here, at least in part, because you believe in his ability to get you out of it soon, but I would not have expected you to feel this indebted to him. Rukia had to admit that, in truth, she was not. She respected Captain Aizen and trusted him would free her, that much was true, but a pretty big reason she was here now was that it had been the only way to save Ichigo from her brother. For her friends, a few days in a cell weren't really much of a bother at all, and besides, Ichigo had identified her as his leader. She still didn't think she could be one in the way Captain Yucatec wanted her to be, but for just a few people, who trusted her and which she in return could trust to cover for the abilities she didn't have, she could pretend to be one. Captain Yucatec seemed to understand what she was thinking even if she didn't voice her thoughts, as he smiled and said, I can see you have a better reason than that, but I imagine it has to do with your mission, so I won't inquire any further. Thank you, Captain. Although I do have a question I wanted to ask. Aizen refused to tell me, so maybe you will. Why do you have him withhold your certification? Rukia wasn't sure how to answer to that, and before she could, suddenly she could hear a lot of shouting and chaos coming from the corridor's door. Captain Yucatec frowned as he got to his feet and went to check, while Rukia considered for a moment if she should try to hijack one of the listening spells embedded in the walls to overhear what was going on, before settling down and deciding that waiting would be better in this case. It didn't take long for Captain Yucatec to come back, and as soon as he was through the door, somebody else who had been waiting after him darted forward, immediately kneeling in front of Rukia's cage with a long breath of relief. Rukia eyed the figure in front of her with surprise, the familiar sight of a head of crimson hairs collected in a high ponytail, a white bandana covering most of the large tattoos over his forehead leaving her very surprised. Rukia, you need to leave. Things are bad. While his loudness was typical, and thus didn't bother Rukia much at all, the urgency, almost desperation in her friend's voice left her very dumbfounded. Renji? What are you doing here? I thought you were in the mortal realm. Indeed, Lieutenant Abarai, it might be best if you explained everything clearly from the beginning. Whatever has you this agitated surely deserves to be explained with calm. Rukia nodded to Captain Yucatec, thankful for his reassuring presence, but Renji didn't seem reassured at all, instead turning to watch the captain with surprise. You didn't know? I was summoned here with absolute urgency, a direct order from the captain commander himself. He has called a full leadership meeting of all captains and lieutenants. They came to get me back directly, and when I heard what was going on, I had to come warn Rukia immediately. Rukia gripped the bars of her cell. This didn't sound good at all. Renji, what happened? Captain Aizen was murdered. And suddenly, Rukia felt as if the ground had been stolen from underneath her feet, and nothing made sense anymore. Check the description for the links to the author.